Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Tonight, we are going somewhere different. We are not starting with a scream. We are not starting with a chase or a weapon or a door kicked in at 2 in the morning. We are starting with silence. We are starting with the kind of silence that feels completely normal until it doesn't. Until someone opens a door and a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning becomes the beginning of one of the strangest, most baffling murder investigations in American history. And the reason it is strange, the reason it kept police stumped for months, the reason it sent one of the most experienced detectives in Texas into a spiral of confusion, is because there was absolutely nothing wrong. Nothing. A man was dead on the floor of a hotel room, and nothing in that room suggested that anything had happened to him at all. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no blood on the walls, no signs of a struggle, nothing broken, nothing missing. Just a man on the carpet, face down, one arm stretched out in front of him, a cigarette resting between his fingers like he had simply leaned over and gone to sleep on the floor. Except he hadn't gone to sleep. He was dead. And the story of how he got there, the story of what happened in the hours before that hotel manager turned the key in the lock, is one that will sit with you for a very long time. His name was Greg Flanagan. He was 55 years old. He worked in the oil and gas industry as a landman, which is a profession that most people outside the energy sector have never heard of. A landman is someone who researches land ownership records, negotiates leases, and handles the legal paperwork that allows oil and gas companies to drill on private property. It is detailed, methodical, sometimes exhausting work. It requires a person who is patient, organized, someone who does not mind reading through stacks of documents for hours on end, who is comfortable working alone, who can focus on small details without losing track of the bigger picture. That description fit Greg Flanagan almost perfectly. By all accounts from everyone who knew him, co-workers, neighbors, family members, the people who had worked alongside him for years, Greg was exactly that kind of man. Quiet, steady, reliable, the kind of person who showed up on time, did the work, said what he meant and meant what he said, and never made a production of himself. He had spent decades building that reputation. He lived in Louisiana with his wife, Susie, and every single week, without exception, he made the drive from Louisiana to Beaumont, Texas, for work. He had been doing it long enough that it no longer felt like a commute. It had become its own kind of ritual. Monday morning, he packed his bag, kissed his wife goodbye, drove to Beaumont, and checked into the same hotel room he always stayed in. Room 348 at the MCM Elegante Hotel. He had stayed in that room so many times that it probably felt more like a second apartment than a hotel. He knew which light switch was which. He knew how cold the air conditioner could get. He knew which channels came in clearly on the television and which ones flickered. He had a routine there, and he kept to it with the same steady consistency he brought to everything else in his life. On Sunday evenings, he drove back to Louisiana. He spent time with Susie. He rested. And then on Monday, he got back in the car and did it all again. This is the portrait that investigators would later try to build of Greg Flanagan. Not just who he was professionally, but who he was as a man. Because when you are investigating a murder, you start with the victim. You start by trying to understand why. Why this person? Why now? What was it about their life, their work, their relationships, their choices that put them in the crosshairs of whoever killed them? And when police started asking those questions about Greg Flanagan, they kept running into the same wall. There was no why. There was no history of violence. There were no threats, no debts, no enemies, no disputes. There was no secret life waiting to be uncovered. The more investigators looked, the more they found exactly what everyone who knew Greg had already told them. He was a decent, quiet, ordinary man who worked hard and loved his wife and had no reason in the world for anyone to want him dead. And yet, he was dead. We are going to spend a long time tonight inside this story, because it deserves that time. It deserves the kind of careful, detailed unraveling that the investigators themselves had to go through to get to the truth. And I promise you, when we get to the answer, When we finally pull back the curtain on what actually happened in room 348 on the night of September 15th, 2010, it is going to hit you differently than you expect. Because the answer is not dramatic in the way you might be imagining right now. It is not a calculated crime. It is not the result of a long and carefully laid plan. It is something far more unsettling than that, because it is the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. It could happen to you. It could happen to someone you love. And the fact that the people responsible almost got away with it entirely, that they sat back and said nothing, did nothing, let Greg Flanagan's wife spend months wondering who killed her husband. That is the part of this story that will make your blood run cold. But we are not there yet. We are still in the beginning. We are still in the part of the story where Greg Flanagan is alive. The week of September 13th, 2010, was not unusual in any way that Greg would have noticed. He drove to Beaumont on Monday, as he always did. He checked into room 348, as he always did. He set his suitcase on the floor near the closet, not on the luggage rack, because he never used the luggage rack. He turned on the television. He adjusted the thermostat, dropping the temperature down to the cool range he preferred. He had a few things he liked to have with him during his evenings at the hotel. Simple things, nothing extravagant. A candy bar, a root beer, cigarettes, the television remote. He was not a man who needed a great deal to be comfortable. He had the things he liked, and he had the quiet, and that was enough. By the evening of September 15th, a Wednesday, the week was more than halfway done. He would have been thinking about home, about Susie, about the drive back to Louisiana in a couple of days. He ate, he settled in, and at some point that evening, he turned to Iron Man 2. The film had been released earlier that year, in May, and had spent the summer cycling through television and hotel movie channels in the way that big blockbusters do. It is the kind of movie that is easy to watch. Action, humor, spectacle. The kind of thing you put on when you want to relax, when you do not want to think too hard, when you just want to be entertained for a couple of hours. Greg Flanagan sat in bed in room 348 and watched Iron Man 2. He had a cigarette. He had his root beer. At some point during the evening, he picked up his phone and sent a message to Susie. It was not a long message. It was not a dramatic farewell. It was just the kind of small, everyday expression of love that couples share without thinking about how much those small moments matter. He wrote to her, "You're doing good, babe." That was the last message Greg Flanagan ever sent. Whatever happened next happened fast. So fast that Greg probably did not fully understand what was occurring. One moment he was in bed, watching television, and then something changed. Something hit him, or he felt something, or something shifted in his body so dramatically that it drove him to his feet. He stood up from the bed. He walked toward the door. He moved the cigarette from his right hand to his left. A small, unconscious gesture, the kind you make when you are about to grab a door handle and you do not want to burn yourself. He reached for the door, and then he went down. He collapsed onto the carpet, face first, and he did not get up again. He was dead within seconds, and the room was silent. And outside in the corridor, nobody heard a thing. In the morning, Greg did not show up for work. This was not something that ever happened. Greg Flanagan was the kind of man who showed up. His co-workers waited. They tried calling his cell phone. No answer. They called again. Nothing. At some point. The precise timeline is not recorded in a way that captures the exact moment the worry shifted into alarm. One of his co-workers made the decision to go to the hotel. They went to room 348. They knocked on the door. Nothing. They knocked again. The hotel manager was called. A key card was produced. The door swung open, and there he was, face down on the carpet, arms stretched out in front of him, cigarette still between his fingers. The room looked exactly as it should have looked. The television was off. The bed was rumpled, but not destroyed. His suitcase was on the floor where he always put it. His wallet was on the nightstand. His personal items were exactly where he would have placed them. There was no sign of a fight. No broken lamp. No overturned chair. No shattered glass. No blood on the floor or the walls. Nothing had been taken. Nothing was out of place, except for Greg himself, who should have been alive and getting ready for work, and was instead lying dead on the floor of a hotel room with no explanation attached to him at all. Detective Scott Apple of the Beaumont Police Department was one of the first investigators on the scene. He was a seasoned detective. He had seen a great deal in his career, and he was not the kind of man who jumped to conclusions without evidence to back them up. He walked through room 348 slowly and carefully. He looked at everything. He documented what he saw and what he did not see. And what he did not see was the thing that bothered him the most. He did not see any reason for this man to be dead. In the absence of obvious violence, in the absence of any signs of struggle or forced entry, in the absence of any indicators of foul play, the initial working assumption was the same assumption most investigators would have made. Natural causes. A man in his mid-50s, living alone in a hotel room during the week, probably a little stressed from the work routine. Maybe some underlying health issues nobody knew about. It was sad, but it was not unheard of. Men died of heart attacks in hotel rooms. Men died of strokes in hotel rooms. It happened. It was not supposed to be a mystery, but the mystery was already sitting in that room, waiting to be found. And it would not stay hidden for long. When the body of Greg Flanagan was transported to the medical examiner's office, it went into the hands of Dr. Tommy Brown. Dr. Brown was methodical in the way that good forensic pathologists always are. He did not skip steps. He did not rush. He began his examination of Greg Flanagan's body the same way he began every examination. Carefully, thoroughly, without preconceptions. He noted Greg's age and general physical condition. He noted the absence of visible external trauma. He began the internal examination. And then, somewhere in the middle of that examination, something stopped him cold. Greg Flanagan's internal injuries were catastrophic. His ribs were broken. His liver was torn. His intestines had been damaged. His heart, specifically the atrium, one of the upper chambers of the heart, had been ruptured. The kind of damage Dr. Brown was seeing inside Greg Flanagan's body was the kind of damage you saw in car accident victims, in people who had been thrown from buildings, in people who had been beaten with extreme force by someone or something that had delivered enormous, concentrated trauma to the body. The internal damage was severe. It was unmistakable. And it was absolutely inconsistent with any natural cause of death that a 55-year-old man might experience after a quiet evening watching a movie in his hotel room. Dr. Tommy Brown looked at the evidence in front of him, and he made his determination. He wrote it down clearly and without equivocation in his official report. The cause of death was not a heart attack. The cause of death was not a stroke. The cause of death was not any kind of natural medical event. The cause of death of Greg Flanagan was listed as homicide. This man had been murdered. And the question that now sat at the center of everything, the question that would drive investigators to the edge of their understanding and eventually force them to bring in outside help, was not who did it or why. It was how. How had someone murdered a man in a locked hotel room, with no weapon, no blood, no noise, no witnesses, and no sign of any violence whatsoever? How was that possible? And the answer, the real answer, was something that nobody in that investigation was prepared for. Not yet. Detective Scott Apple received the autopsy results and read them the way you read something that does not make immediate sense. He read them once. Then he read them again. Then he probably sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, because the document in front of him had just transformed a case he thought he understood into something he did not understand at all. It had transformed a sad but straightforward natural death into an active homicide investigation. And it had done so without providing a single additional clue about how the homicide had actually occurred. The medical examiner had answered one question and, in doing so, had opened 10 more. The broken ribs, the torn liver, the ruptured heart atrium, the damaged intestines. These were not small injuries. These were not the kind of injuries you sustain from a minor fall or a brief altercation that leaves no mark on the room. These were the kinds of injuries that required significant force. Significant, sustained, directed force. The kind that comes from a severe beating. And yet there was no evidence anywhere in room 348 that a beating had taken place. The carpet was clean. The furniture was undamaged. The walls showed nothing. The bedsheets were wrinkled the way they get when someone has been sitting on a bed watching television, not the way they look when someone has been thrown across a room or wrestled to the floor. There was no blood at all. The wallet on the nightstand still had cash in it. Greg Flanagan's personal belongings were undisturbed. And perhaps most strangely of all, no one, not the hotel staff, not the guests in nearby rooms, not anyone in the entire building, had heard a single sound coming from room 348 that night. Think about what a beating that produces those kinds of injuries would sound like. Think about the noise. Bones breaking is not a quiet event. A man fighting for his life is not a quiet event. A man being struck with enough force to tear his liver and rupture the atrium of his heart does not go silently. He screams. He struggles. He hits back. Furniture moves. Bodies hit walls. The sounds of violence carry through the thin walls of a hotel with the kind of clarity that makes other guests call the front desk. And yet none of that had happened. None of it. The corridor had been peaceful all night. The neighboring rooms had been undisturbed. Nobody had called the front desk to report anything. Nobody had heard Greg Flanagan at all after the point at which he had presumably been alive and watching his movie. This was the impossibility that sat at the center of the investigation. A man murdered in plain sight, in the middle of an occupied hotel, in a room that showed no signs of murder, surrounded by people who heard nothing. It was the kind of scenario that made experienced investigators question whether they were missing something obvious. Detective Apple and the team around him began pulling at every thread they could find, looking for the loose end that would unravel the whole thing and reveal the answer they were desperate to find. The first significant line of inquiry pointed them toward hotel staff. Specifically, it pointed them toward a maintenance worker who had access to the hotel's guest rooms. This man had a prior criminal history that included a sex offense, which is the kind of detail that immediately flags a person of interest in any investigation involving a victim found alone in a private room. The theory constructed around him was circumstantial, but not entirely without logic. He had access. He had a key or the means to obtain one. He could have entered room 348 without forcing the lock, which would explain the lack of forced entry. If he had entered quietly, if Greg had been caught off guard, there was a theoretical scenario in which an altercation could have been controlled enough to be partially hidden. But the theory was theoretical in exactly the most frustrating sense of the word. There was no physical evidence linking this man to Greg Flanagan or to room 348. There was no forensic trace. There were no witnesses. There was nothing that a prosecutor could stand up in front of a jury and point to. The thread was there, but when investigators pulled it, it didn't lead anywhere. It just came loose. The second major line of inquiry led them next door. Room 349. Room 349 was occupied that week by a group of union electricians who were in Beaumont for a job. The kind of work that brings tradespeople to a city for a week, puts them up in a hotel with a per diem, and leaves them with evenings free and no particular agenda. On the night of September 15th, the electricians in room 349 had, by multiple accounts, been drinking. Not disruptively, not in a way that had drawn any formal complaints, but drinking nonetheless. And they were adjacent to Greg Flanagan. They shared a wall with him. If something had happened at the border between those two rooms, some kind of altercation at the door, some kind of confrontation in the corridor, it was possible, at least theoretically, that these men were involved. Investigators went to interview them. The electricians were cooperative. They answered questions. They expressed appropriate shock and sadness at the news of their neighbor's death. They said they had heard nothing unusual that night. They said they had no interaction with Greg Flanagan. They said they had gone to bed, slept, and had been completely unaware of anything happening next door. Nothing in their demeanor, or at least nothing that the investigators were able to identify at the time, suggested that they were lying. Nothing set off the internal alarms that experienced detectives learned to trust over years of conducting interviews. They seemed like exactly what they appeared to be, a group of working men who had been staying in a hotel room that happened to share a wall with the room where a man had died. The investigation continued. Police dug deeper into Greg Flanagan's personal life, looking for the kind of hidden dimension that sometimes emerges when investigators start pressing. They were looking for a secret, an affair, perhaps, or a financial dispute, or a gambling debt, or some connection to a world that his wife and co-workers did not know about. They talked to everyone who had known him. They examined his phone records, his financial records, his email correspondence. They reached out to his professional contacts in the oil and gas industry. They asked the hard questions that had to be asked, the ones that sometimes make the grieving family members recoil in offense, because someone has to ask them. Was he involved in anything he shouldn't have been? Had he made enemies? Was there anyone in his life who might have wanted him gone? The answer, every single time, was no. Greg Flanagan was exactly who he appeared to be. A working man, a husband, a professional in his field, a man who kept to himself, did his job, and went home to his wife every weekend. There was no secret life. There was no hidden dimension. There was no enemy waiting in the shadows. Greg Flanagan was precisely the wrong kind of victim for a murder investigation. He was the kind of man who gave investigators absolutely nothing to work with, because he had done nothing to put himself in the path of danger. He had simply been in his hotel room, watching a movie, and something had ended his life. And nobody knew what that something was. The weeks that followed were difficult for Susie Flanagan in a way that is almost impossible to put into words. She had lost her husband. That loss was enormous enough on its own. The kind of grief that reshapes a person's entire world, that changes the texture of every morning when you wake up and reach across the bed and remember all over again. But Susie's grief was compounded by something that made it uniquely unbearable. She did not know what had happened to Greg. She did not have an explanation. She did not have an answer. She had a determination from the medical examiner that her husband had been murdered, and she had the image of him lying face down on a hotel carpet with no explanation attached to him. And she had a police investigation that was generating questions without producing answers. And she had to get up every day and live inside that uncertainty while also living inside her grief. That combination, the grief and the not knowing, is one of the cruelest things that can happen to a human being, and Susie Flanagan was living through it without a single moment of relief. She talked to the investigators. She cooperated fully. She answered every question they put to her with patience and detail, because she wanted them to find the answer as desperately as they did. She went over the details of Greg's life and habits and relationships more times than she could count. She told them about his routines, about his work, about the hotel, about the last message he had sent her. She told them about the kind of man he was. She told them that whatever had happened to Greg, she needed to know. She needed to understand. She could not accept a future in which Greg Flanagan's death remained unexplained. She refused to accept that. A reward was offered. $50,000 for any information leading to an arrest in the death of Greg Flanagan. It was a substantial amount of money, the kind that tends to loosen lips that were previously sealed, the kind that brings forward the people who know things but have been calculating whether speaking up is worth the risk. The reward was publicized. The case received media attention, and nothing happened. No one called. No one came forward. No one slipped a note under a door or sent an anonymous tip through a third party. The silence that had surrounded Greg Flanagan's death continued, thick and stubborn, resisting every effort to break through it. Months passed. The initial intensity of the investigation, the surge of activity that always marks the early days of a new homicide case, began to level off. The detectives on the case did not abandon it, because good detectives do not abandon murder cases, and Detective Scott Apple was a good detective. But the active leads had been exhausted. The theories had been tested and found wanting. The investigation was, in the language of law enforcement, going cold. Not officially closed, not forgotten, but moving into that difficult liminal space where resources have to be shifted to newer cases while the old one sits in a file, waiting for the piece of information that has not yet arrived. Susie Flanagan watched this happen, and she made a decision. If the official investigation was running out of steam, she was not. If the police had hit a wall, she would find someone who could climb it. She had heard about a private investigator, a man with a reputation that preceded him in the kind of circles where cold cases and impossible investigations were discussed. His name was Ken Brennan. He had spent years as a cop on Long Island, working cases that ranged from routine to incredibly complex. Then he had moved into the world of federal law enforcement, working as a DEA agent, which meant he had seen not just the ordinary crimes that filled police department caseloads, but also the organized, layered, sophisticated criminality that required a different set of skills to unravel. After his federal career, he had become a private investigator specializing in exactly the kinds of cases that had beaten everyone else. The cold cases, the apparent dead ends, the situations where the conventional approaches had all been tried and all failed. Susie found Ken Brennan. She told him about Greg. She told him about the hotel room and the autopsy and the impossible crime scene and the months of investigation that had produced nothing. She told him she needed someone to look at this with fresh eyes, someone who was not bound by the assumptions that had accumulated over the months, someone who was willing to start from the very beginning and look at every detail without any preconceptions. Ken Brennan listened to everything she said. He agreed to take the case. What happened next would eventually lead to one of the most unusual, and surprising resolutions in the history of Texas cold case investigations. But the path to that resolution was going to be long, and it was going to require the kind of patient, granular attention to detail that most people are not capable of sustaining. Ken Brennan was capable of it. He had spent a career training himself to see the things that other people walked past. And the thing he was about to see, the tiny, overlooked detail that had been sitting in the middle of this case from the very beginning, was going to change everything. He started by getting his hands on the case file. Every document the Beaumont Police Department had assembled in the months since Greg's death. Every photograph taken at the scene. Every interview transcript. Every page of the autopsy report. He read through all of it, slowly and methodically. The way you read something when you are not just looking for information, but looking for the shape of what is missing. The thing that should be there and isn't. The detail that doesn't fit. The inconsistency that everyone else has explained away or simply stopped noticing because they have looked at it too many times. And then Ken Brennan drove to Beaumont, Texas. He went to the MCM Elegante Hotel. He stood in the corridor outside room 348 and looked at the door. He looked at the room. He looked at the photographs again, cross-referencing them against the physical space in front of him. He was quiet for a while. He moved through the room carefully. And then he said something to Detective Scott Apple that Detective Apple did not expect. He said he thought he already knew how Greg Flanagan had died. Apple stared at him. He had been working this case for months. His team had been over every inch of that room, every page of every record. And this man, who had been looking at the file for a fraction of that time, who had just walked into the room for the first time, was standing there telling him he already had a theory? Apple was not dismissive. He was too experienced for that. And he had asked Brennan to come precisely because he needed a new perspective, but he was skeptical. He wanted to know what Brennan was seeing that he had missed. And Brennan told him to look at the photographs again. Look at Greg. Look at exactly where he was lying and exactly how. Look at the position of his hands. Look at the cigarette. The cigarette that Greg Flanagan had been holding when he died was in his left hand. Greg Flanagan was right-handed. That was the clue that nobody had noticed. That was the thread that Ken Brennan had pulled from the case file, the thing that had not fit, the detail that told a story if you knew how to read it. And the story it told was about a man who was alive, who stood up from his bed, who walked toward the door of his room, who moved his cigarette from his dominant hand to his other hand in preparation for reaching for the door handle, and who never made it through the door. That was the story. And now the question was, what had stopped him? Ken Brennan stood in the middle of room 348 and did something that seemed almost too simple to matter. He walked through it, not as an investigator cataloging evidence, not as someone building a formal record, but as a person trying to understand the movement of another person through a space. He started at the bed. He looked at where the bed sheets were disturbed. He traced the path from the bed to the door. It was maybe 15 feet, not a great distance, not a journey that would take more than a few seconds. And he thought about Greg Flanagan's last moments. Here is what Brennan believed had happened, reconstructed from that single detail about the cigarette. Greg had been lying in bed, watching Iron Man 2, smoking a cigarette. He was right-handed. The cigarette had been in his right hand, where it would naturally be for a right-handed person who was relaxing and not paying particular attention to which hand was doing what. And then something changed. Something made Greg stand up from the bed. Something motivated him to get to his feet and move toward the door. And the reason Brennan could tell that Greg had been moving toward the door, rather than just standing up to stretch or go to the bathroom or refill his root beer, was the cigarette. The cigarette had moved from Greg's right hand to his left hand. That transfer, that small and unconscious gesture of switching the cigarette so that his dominant hand would be free, was the gesture of someone preparing to grab a door handle. It was so automatic, so completely unremarkable, that Greg probably did not even think about doing it. It was the kind of thing your hands do without instructions from your brain, the kind of muscle memory that develops over years of basic daily actions. You are about to open a door. You have something in your right hand. You move it to your left hand. You reach for the handle. Simple. But Greg never reached the handle. He got close. He was found near the door, not at the bed, but he never got there. Something stopped him. Something happened to him while he was crossing that 15-foot distance from the bed to the door. Something so sudden and so catastrophic that he went down without being able to stop himself, without being able to call for help, without being able to do anything at all. He simply fell. and he died on the carpet with the cigarette still in his left hand, because the last thing he had done before whatever happened was make that small, automatic transfer. And that tiny detail told Brennan something crucial. Whatever had hit Greg had come from the direction of the bed, not the direction of the door. It had hit him while he was moving, while he was already on his feet and crossing the room. It had not been a confrontation at the door. It had not been someone he had let into the room or someone who had come through the door after him. It had come from behind him, from the side, from somewhere other than the door. And it had been fast, instantaneous. Greg had not had time to react, not had time to turn, not had time to do anything except fall. Brennan filed that away and moved on to the next piece of the puzzle. The temperature. When Greg Flanagan's body was found on the morning of September 16th, the room was hot. Uncomfortably hot. Not the kind of warmth you get when a room has been sealed for a few hours and the air has grown stale, but genuinely, noticeably warm, to the point where the people who entered the room that morning commented on it. This was strange for one specific reason. Everyone who knew Greg, everyone who had spent any time with him, everyone who had stayed near him at work or known him in any capacity that involved shared indoor spaces, all said the same thing about him. Greg Flanagan ran cold. He liked his spaces cool. He was the person who always wanted the air conditioner turned up, always wanted the thermostat pushed down, always preferred a slightly chilly environment over a warm one. When he was in his hotel room, the first thing he did when he settled in for the evening was crank the air conditioning. He liked it cold. That was his preference, and he maintained it consistently every single night he stayed at that hotel. So why was the room hot when he was found? Brennan went to hotel management with a specific question. Had anything happened to the climate control in room 348 on the night of September 15th? Were there any maintenance calls, any power issues, anything that might have disrupted the operation of the air conditioning unit in that room? He was prepared for the hotel staff to have no information, for this to be another dead end. Instead, he got an answer that fundamentally changed the shape of the investigation. Yes, something had happened to the climate control that night. The hotel manager confirmed that there had been an electrical issue on the third floor on the evening of September 15th. A circuit breaker had blown. The circuit breaker controlled the power supply to several rooms on that corridor, including, and this is the detail that hit Brennan like a freight train, room 348 and room 349. Both rooms had lost power. The air conditioning had shut off. A maintenance technician had been called to the floor to reset the breaker. According to hotel records, that maintenance call was logged and completed at 8:30 in the evening. The power was restored at 8:30. The air conditioning in Greg Flanagan's room came back on at 8:30, and Greg Flanagan was dead sometime not long after 8:30. The timeline crystallized in a way that it had never done before. For the first time, investigators had a bracket around the time of death that was not just an approximation based on body temperature. They had an electrical event that had disrupted the climate of the room, and they had a body that had been found in a room where the temperature had not returned to its normal cool range. Meaning Greg had died before the air conditioning had had time to cool the room back down. He had died close to 8:30, close to when the power was restored. Brennan sat with this information for a while. He thought about what it meant for the picture of that evening. Greg is in bed at 8:30 watching Iron Man 2. The circuit breaker blows. The power goes out in his room. The power goes out in room 349 as well. What happens in those rooms in the period when the power is out? What does Greg do? What do the electricians next door do? The power comes back on at 8:30. And then, shortly after 8:30, something happens that kills Greg Flanagan. Something that comes from a direction that is not the door. Something that hits him so fast he cannot react. Something that produces catastrophic internal trauma without leaving a single visible mark on the room. Brennan went back to room 349 in his mind. He thought about the electricians again. They had been interviewed before, and they had been cooperative and apparently honest. But Brennan had not been in the room when those interviews were conducted. He had not watched the men's faces, had not listened to the quality of their silences, had not had the opportunity to sit across from them and make his own assessment. He wanted to talk to them himself. Not yet. He was not ready yet, because he did not have enough specific questions to make the most of that conversation. He needed one more piece of the puzzle first. He needed to know where the bullet had gone. He had not said the word bullet yet. Not out loud. Not to Detective Apple or to anyone else connected to the official investigation. But the thought had been building in him since he first looked at the autopsy report, since he first read about the internal injuries and tried to reconcile them with the absence of any external evidence. The injuries Dr. Tommy Brown had documented in Greg Flanagan's body were severe. They were the kind of injuries that resulted from concentrated, directed force penetrating the body. You did not break ribs and tear a liver and rupture a heart atrium by being struck with a blunt object, not without leaving extensive external bruising and soft tissue damage that would have been immediately obvious to the first people who saw the body. You produced those kinds of injuries with something that traveled through the body, something that moved fast, something small that carried an enormous amount of kinetic energy and transferred that energy to every piece of tissue it passed through. You produced those injuries with a bullet, but there had been no bullet wound found on the body. Dr. Tommy Brown's initial examination had not noted a bullet wound. There had been no entry wound, no exit wound, no indication of a projectile of any kind, which meant one of two things. Either the bullet was still inside the body and had not been identified in the initial examination, or there was an entry wound that had been missed. And if there was an entry wound that had been missed, the question was where? Where on the human body could a bullet enter in a way that the wound would be subtle enough to escape initial detection? Where could a small caliber round enter a body, travel through the internal cavity, producing catastrophic damage to multiple organs, and do so through an entry point that might not immediately call attention to itself? Brennan thought about the trajectory. The bullet had to have come from the direction of the bed, not the door. Greg had been moving from the bed toward the door. The force had struck him while he was in motion. If he had been shot, and Brennan was increasingly certain that he had been shot, the bullet had traveled from somewhere behind him, from the direction of the bed or the wall at the head of the bed, and had entered his body from a direction consistent with him being in mid-stride, upright, moving away from the bed. A bullet coming from that direction, at the height of a man mid-stride, from somewhere near the bed or through the wall adjacent to the bed. What angle would that produce? Where would that bullet enter the body? Brennan went back to the room one more time. He stood near the bed. He looked at the wall. He looked at the room next door through the lens of trajectory and angle and physics. And then he said something that made Detective Apple stop what he was doing and stare at him. He said they needed to look for a bullet. Not a bullet in the body. A bullet in the walls. Apple pointed out that the room had been searched. The walls had been examined. Nothing had been found. Brennan acknowledged this. Then he said he wanted to look again. He wanted to look specifically, carefully, at the wall between room 348 and room 349. He wanted to look at every inch of it. Not just the obvious places, but the places that might have been repaired. He wanted to look at the texture of the paint, at the smoothness of the plaster, at the places where the surface might have been disturbed and then restored. He was looking for a repair. He was looking for the kind of patch job you do when you are trying to hide a hole, when you are trying to make a wall look undamaged when it is not. They began to search every inch of the wall, running their hands along the surface, looking for variations in texture, for places where the paint was slightly different in sheen or thickness, for the subtle tactile evidence of a repair. And at first they found nothing. The wall looked clean. It looked exactly like a standard hotel room wall, which is to say slightly beige and somewhat dinged from years of luggage and furniture and general occupancy, but fundamentally intact. No visible holes. No obvious patches. And then Brennan stopped. He was looking at a small area of the wall, not near the floor and not near the ceiling, but at a height that would correspond roughly to a man lying on a bed. There was a place in the wall where the surface was not quite right. It was subtle. Too subtle for someone who was not specifically looking for it to register, but it was there. A slight variation in texture. A faint difference in the way the surface caught the light. Not damage. Not a hole. Something that looked like a repair. Something that looked like someone had filled in a small depression and smoothed it over and painted it, doing a reasonably decent job, but not a perfect one. Not perfect enough to fool someone who was looking for exactly that kind of imperfection. Brennan looked at the spot. Then he looked at where it was in relation to room 349. Then he asked a question that temporarily silenced everyone in the room. He asked whether anyone had looked at the wall from the other side. The answer was no. Nobody had looked at the wall from the other side in any kind of systematic way. Room 349 had been checked in the initial investigation, of course. The electricians had been interviewed there. The room had been looked at. but it had been examined as a potential crime scene only in the sense of looking for evidence of a confrontation, a struggle, something that connected its occupants to Greg Flanagan. Nobody had examined its walls as potential ballistic pathways. Nobody had thought to ask the walls of room 349 what they knew. Detective Apple arranged access to room 349. It was no longer occupied. The electricians had long since gone. The work that had brought them to Beaumont had been completed weeks ago, and the room had been turned over and re-rented in the ordinary course of hotel operations. But it was available now, and they went into it. And when they went in and started looking at the wall that room 349 shared with room 348, the wall on the other side of the spot that Brennan had identified in room 348, they found what they were looking for. There was a hole in the wall. A small, round, clean hole. Exactly the kind of hole that a fired bullet makes when it passes through drywall at high velocity. The hole was small enough and positioned in such a way that someone who was not looking for it, someone who was cleaning the room or just passing through, might not have noticed it. But it was unmistakably there, and it had been filled. Not professionally filled, not with spackle and primer and properly matched paint the way a hotel maintenance crew would address a wall repair. It had been filled with toothpaste, white toothpaste, pressed into the hole and smoothed over with a finger, dry and hard now after weeks, but unmistakably toothpaste. Someone had fired a bullet through this wall, and then someone who was panicked, someone who did not have the time or the tools or the composure to do a proper repair job, had taken their toothpaste from the bathroom counter and used it to fill the hole they had made. They had tried to hide what they had done with the most expedient materials available to them, and they had almost succeeded. Almost. Ken Brennan stood in room 349 and looked at that hole in the wall and felt the pieces of the investigation falling into alignment around him. He thought about everything he knew. The circuit breaker blowing on the evening of September 15th. The maintenance call at 8:30. The electrical union men in this room, who had been drinking that evening, who had been without power for some period of time. Greg Flanagan in room 348, settling in for the night, watching his movie, running the air conditioner cold the way he always did. A bullet hole in the wall of room 349, filled with toothpaste by someone who had been trying to hide what had happened. A bullet hole positioned in a way that a shot fired from somewhere in room 349 would have traveled through the wall and into room 348 and struck the man lying in the bed. Greg Flanagan had been shot through the wall. He had not been beaten. He had not been confronted. He had not encountered his killer face to face. He had been lying in his bed watching Iron Man 2, completely unaware, and a bullet had come through the wall from the next room and hit him. He had stood up, the shock, the pain, the physiological response to sudden catastrophic injury, and he had stumbled toward the door, transferring the cigarette to his left hand, reaching for the handle, trying to get out, and then he had gone down. Dead before anyone could help him. Dead before anyone even knew anything had happened. In the room next door, the people who had fired the bullet knew exactly what they had done, and they had taken their toothpaste and filled the hole in the wall, and they had said nothing. But the question of where the bullet had actually ended up, inside Greg's body or somewhere else in the room, still needed an answer. Brennan went back to the autopsy report with new eyes. He thought about trajectory. He thought about physics. A bullet fired from room 349 through a shared wall at the angle and height consistent with the hole they had found. Where would it travel on the other side? It would have been heading in a particular direction, at a particular height, toward the bed. And if Greg was in bed when the shot was fired, the bullet would have struck him while he was lying down. Then the question was where? Where on his body would a bullet hit a man lying in a particular position, at a particular height relative to the floor, traveling in a particular direction? The answer that Brennan and the investigators came to, the answer that was eventually confirmed through careful physical reconstruction and a very uncomfortable second conversation with the medical examiner, was deeply disturbing. The bullet had entered Greg Flanagan's body through his scrotum. This was the reason the entry wound had been missed in the initial examination. It was the reason that Dr. Tommy Brown had not identified a bullet wound. It was not the kind of entry point that you were looking for when you were examining a body for signs of violent trauma. It was not in a location that called attention to itself. And the wound itself, in the context of the surrounding tissue and the way the bullet had traveled, had not presented with the obvious characteristics that would have immediately flagged it. But when Dr. Brown went back to the photographs and the evidence with the specific knowledge of what he was looking for and where to look, he saw it. The bullet had entered through the lower part of Greg Flanagan's body and had traveled upward through his torso. And as it traveled, it had done exactly the damage that Brown's initial autopsy had documented. The broken ribs, the torn liver, the damaged intestines, the ruptured heart atrium. Every catastrophic injury was accounted for. Every piece of the internal damage now made perfect, terrible sense. Greg Flanagan had been shot by a bullet that he never saw coming, fired by someone who had no idea he was even there, through a wall that separated two ordinary hotel rooms on an ordinary Wednesday evening in Beaumont, Texas. The horror of this, once it settled in, was profound. Think about what it meant. Think about Greg Flanagan, who had done nothing wrong, who had no enemies, who was sitting in his hotel room watching a movie and drinking a root beer, doing everything right, living his quiet and ordinary life exactly the way he always had, and through absolutely no fault of his own, through no connection to the people in the next room, through no action or decision he had made that night, a bullet came through the wall and killed him. He did not know the people in room 349. They did not know him. He had done nothing to provoke them, nothing to antagonize them, nothing that had any bearing on what happened to him at all. He was just on the other side of a wall, and someone did not treat a loaded weapon with the care and respect that a loaded weapon demands, and Greg Flanagan paid for that with his life. And then they covered it up. That was the part that moved the investigation into territory that was both criminal and deeply, viscerally wrong. They covered it up. They took the toothpaste from the bathroom counter and they pressed it into the hole in the wall, and they went to bed, or they tried to go to bed, knowing what had happened on the other side of that wall. And in the morning, when the commotion started, when Greg's co-workers arrived and the manager was called, and the police showed up and Greg's body was removed from room 348 on a stretcher, these men were present. They were in the building. They may have watched from a distance as the investigation began. They certainly knew that Greg Flanagan had been found dead. They knew, with absolute certainty, that they were the reason he was dead. And they said nothing. They checked out of the hotel. They went back to their lives. They said nothing to police during the initial interviews. They said nothing as the investigation continued. They said nothing when the reward was announced. They said nothing for months, while Susie Flanagan sat at home, not knowing what had happened to her husband, while Detective Apple worked his case without the crucial piece of information that would have solved it in the first week. They said nothing, and Greg's death remained unexplained, and Susie Flanagan's grief remained unresolved, because the people who knew the truth had decided that their own safety and comfort were more important than the truth. Brennan and Apple now had the what and the how. They had a bullet hole in a wall, filled with toothpaste. They had a trajectory. They had an autopsy that, when re-examined with new information, confirmed a bullet wound. They had the outline of what had happened, but they needed the who. They needed the names, the details, the specific account of who had fired the weapon and what had happened in room 349 that night. They needed evidence that would hold up in a court of law, not just physical evidence, which they had, but the human testimony that would complete the picture and lead to a prosecution. That meant going back to the electricians. The challenge was significant. These men had been interviewed before and had said nothing incriminating. They had had months to construct and solidify their story, to decide what they were going to say and what they were going to keep quiet about. They had, presumably, talked to each other, maybe extensively, maybe just enough to agree on a version of events that they would all stick to. They had had time to get comfortable with their silence, to convince themselves that they had gotten away with it, that the investigation was fading into the cold case file, and their lives were safe. Approaching them again, without tipping them off to how much investigators now knew, required care. It required the kind of delicate, strategic approach that Ken Brennan was experienced at executing. He thought about how to do it. He thought about which of the electricians might be most likely to break, which one was carrying the most weight, which one had the least investment in maintaining the silence. Because in any group of people who are collectively hiding a terrible secret, there is almost always a hierarchy of commitment to that secret. There is almost always one person who is more comfortable with the cover-up, who is more invested in it, and there is almost always one person who is less comfortable, who has been lying awake thinking about what happened, who feels the weight of it in a way that the others perhaps do not. Brennan's job was to find that person and create the conditions under which that person would speak. He found him. His name was Tim Steinmetz. Tim Steinmetz was one of the electricians who had been staying in room 349 on the night Greg Flanagan died. He was one of the men who had been questioned early in the investigation and had said nothing useful. He was one of the men who had gone home afterward and resumed his life, while Greg Flanagan's wife waited for answers. But Tim Steinmetz was also, according to the picture that Brennan was carefully assembling, the person in that group who had been least comfortable with what had happened. Not innocent. Brennan was not going to characterize him as innocent, but perhaps the most conflicted, the one who had not been entirely at peace with the decision to stay silent. Brennan did not approach Steinmetz directly at first. He gathered information. He found out where Steinmetz was working, what his life looked like now, who he associated with. He thought about how to approach the conversation in a way that would maximize the chances of getting the truth. And he thought about the central actor in all of this, not Steinmetz, but the man Brennan had come to believe was the one who had fired the weapon. The man who had been drunk in room 349 and pulled out a gun and pointed it at his friends and played around with it and pulled the trigger, either deliberately or through the catastrophic negligence of someone handling a loaded firearm without proper care. A man named Lance Mueller. Everything that Brennan had been piecing together pointed toward Mueller as the person who had fired the shot. He was the one who had brought the gun. He was the one who had been playing with it. And he was, presumably, the one who had the most to lose if the truth came out, which meant he was also the one most likely to have been the most forceful advocate for silence, the one who had pressed the others to say nothing, the one who had the most powerful personal motivation to ensure that the toothpaste in the wall hole stayed undisturbed and the investigation continued going cold. Brennan went to Steinmetz. He did not come in swinging. He did not come in with accusations. He came in with the quiet, steady confidence of someone who already knows the answers to most of the questions he is asking, who is not trying to trick anyone, but who is also not going to pretend he does not know what he knows. He sat across from Steinmetz and he talked. And as the conversation progressed, as Brennan let it become clear without ever saying it directly that the investigation had moved forward, that the physical evidence had spoken, that the toothpaste in the wall was not the secret that it had been, Steinmetz began to show the cracks that Brennan had suspected were there. It did not happen all at once. These things rarely do. There is a process to a confession, a journey that begins with denial and moves through various stages of partial acknowledgement before arriving at the whole truth, and Steinmetz moved through that process. He shifted in his seat. He contradicted himself in small ways and then corrected himself. He asked questions that an innocent person would not think to ask, and eventually, incrementally, he began to talk. He began to describe what had actually happened in room 349 on the night of September 15th, 2010. They had been drinking. That much had been established early and was not contested. After the workday, back at the hotel, they had bought alcohol and settled in for the evening in the way that working men sometimes do when they are away from home on a job, when the day is done and there is nothing particular to do and the evening stretches out in front of them. They were relaxed, perhaps more relaxed than they should have been. And Lance Mueller had a 9mm pistol. Why Mueller had a 9mm pistol with him on a work trip to Beaumont, Texas, is one of those questions that does not have a satisfying answer, because there is no satisfying answer. A lot of people in Texas carry firearms. It is a state with a strong culture of personal firearms ownership, and the presence of a handgun in a hotel room occupied by a Texan on a work trip is not the shocking anomaly that it might appear to be in other contexts. But the presence of a loaded handgun in a room full of drinking men is always a problem, because alcohol impairs judgment and loosens inhibitions and makes people careless in ways they would not be careless if they were sober. And Mueller, by the account that was beginning to emerge, had been careless in the most consequential way possible. He had pulled the gun out. He had been showing it off, or playing with it, or doing the thing that people sometimes do with weapons when they are drunk and their judgment is impaired, pointing it at things, gesturing with it, treating it as a prop rather than as a lethal tool that demands constant, sober attention to where it is pointed and whether the safety is on and what is on the other side of whatever it is aimed at. He had pointed it at his friends. He had made the kinds of jokes that drunk people with guns make, the kinds of jokes that are never funny because a loaded gun is not a punchline. And at some point, in some configuration of Mueller's hand and the gun and the angle at which it was held, the trigger was pulled. There was a report, loud, in the confined space of a hotel room. though perhaps not as distinctive or as alarming as you might expect a gunshot to be, since people do not always immediately recognize the sound of a single gunshot indoors for what it is, especially if they have been drinking. The bullet left the chamber. It crossed the room. It passed through the drywall of the shared wall between room 349 and room 348, and it crossed the boundary between one ordinary hotel room and another ordinary hotel room, and it found Greg Flanagan in his bed. In room 349, there was a moment of stunned silence. And then there was panic. They did not know at first that they had hit anyone. They knew a gun had discharged. They knew the bullet had gone into the wall. But they did not know what was on the other side of the wall at that exact moment. They did not know that Greg Flanagan had been lying in bed directly in the path of the shot. They did not know, not yet, that a man was already dying on the carpet of the next room. What they knew was that a gun had gone off in their hotel room, and they had a bullet hole in the wall, and they were a group of men who had been drinking, and they were in serious trouble. The decision to cover it up was probably not a long deliberation. It was probably the kind of desperate, instinctive response that emerges from panic. Someone grabbed the toothpaste, someone pressed it into the hole, someone said to say nothing, and the group calcified around that decision in the way that groups sometimes do when they are frightened and not thinking clearly. They covered the hole. They stayed in the room. They went to sleep, or they tried to. And in the morning, when the activity started in the corridor, when voices were raised and doors were knocked on, and the unmistakable atmosphere of crisis began to gather around room 348, they stayed quiet. They checked out. They went home. But as the months passed, the weight of the secret had apparently not sat equally on all of them. And Steinmetz had been carrying more than his share. When Brennan sat across from him and made it clear that the investigation had moved forward in ways that Steinmetz did not know about, something in Steinmetz gave way. The full story came out. The drinking, the gun, Mueller playing with it, the accidental discharge, the panic, the toothpaste. All of it. And the name at the center of it was Lance Mueller. Now law enforcement had what they needed to move to the next stage. They had a confession from a witness. They had physical evidence from the hotel room. They had a revised autopsy finding that confirmed a bullet wound. They had a coherent, complete account of what had happened on the night of September 15th, 2010, in the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. What they needed now was to bring Lance Mueller into a conversation without allowing him to understand how much they knew, in a way that would produce either a confession or a contradiction that could be used against him. And this is where law enforcement employed a technique that has been used for decades in complex investigations, a technique that, when executed properly, can be extraordinarily effective at producing the kind of evidence that closes cases and leads to prosecutions. They arranged for Tim Steinmetz to call Lance Mueller. They recorded the call. Steinmetz picked up the phone. He dialed Mueller's number. And when Mueller answered, Steinmetz began to talk about what had happened in Beaumont. He talked about Greg Flanagan. He talked about the investigation. He let Mueller understand, gradually, carefully, in the way that the conversation unfolded, that the truth was coming out, that the investigation was no longer cold, that the toothpaste in the wall had been found, that the bullet had been traced, that people knew what had happened. Mueller did not immediately confess in the way that people sometimes imagine confessions happening, in a dramatic rush of guilt and remorse and full disclosure. He reacted the way people react when the thing they have been afraid of for a long time suddenly materializes, with shock, with anxiety, with the first fractures appearing in the composure that he had maintained for months. And as those fractures appeared, as the recorded conversation captured the quality of his reaction, the fear in his voice, the way he responded to specific details about the investigation that an innocent man would not have responded to in that way, the case against him solidified. Law enforcement had their case. They had the physical evidence. They had Steinmetz's testimony. They had the recorded call. They had the revised autopsy. They had the trajectory analysis from room 349 to room 348. They had the comprehensive picture of what had happened, who was responsible, and what had been done afterward to conceal it. It was time to bring this to a close. It was time for Greg Flanagan's wife to have the answer she had been waiting for since a hotel manager opened the door of room 348 on the morning of September 16, 2010, and found her husband on the floor. And somewhere in Beaumont, Texas, and somewhere in Louisiana where Susie Flanagan was living with her unanswered grief, The machinery of justice began its final movements toward the conclusion that had taken more than a year to arrive. But before we get to what happened in that courtroom, before we hear what Susie Flanagan said to the man who had killed her husband, there is more of this story that has not been fully explored yet. There are things about Ken Brennan and his investigation that tell us something important about how cold cases get solved, about what it takes to see what everyone else has missed. And there are things about Greg Flanagan himself, about the life he lived and the man he was, and the way the people around him experienced his loss, that deserve more time than we have given them so far. Before we talk about what happened in that courtroom, we need to go back. We need to go back to Susie. Because it would be easy, in the momentum of an investigation story, to let Susie Flanagan become a background figure, the grieving wife, the person who made the phone call that brought Ken Brennan into the picture, the woman who delivered the emotional closing statement at the end. It would be easy to let her fade into the backdrop of the procedural drama. But Susie Flanagan is not a background figure in this story. She is, in many ways, the central figure. She is the reason the case was solved. She is the reason the toothpaste in the wall was found. Without Susie Flanagan's refusal to accept an unresolved death as the final chapter of her husband's story, Lance Mueller would never have faced justice. Greg Flanagan's death would have remained a cold case file. And the men who sat in room 349 and stayed silent while Susie grieved would have carried their secret to wherever secrets go when they are never exposed. Think about what Susie was living through during those months of investigation. She had lost Greg, and the grief of losing a spouse, the person who has been your partner, your companion, your daily anchor, is unlike most other kinds of grief because it does not just remove a person from your life. It removes the framework of your life. It removes the morning routines and the evening conversations and the small domestic rhythms that you do not even think of as important until they are gone. It removes the person you call first when something good happens and the person you reach for when something bad happens. It removes the familiar, and it replaces all of that with a silence that is not comfortable and is not restful, but is simply empty. A silence that sits in the house with you and does not explain itself. Susie had to live inside that silence without even the cold comfort of knowing what had happened. The families of accident victims have a particular kind of grief, terrible, but understandable, because they know what happened. The families of people who die of illness have a particular kind of grief, prolonged, but at least comprehensible. Susie had the grief of someone who had been told her husband was murdered, but had not been told how, or by whom, or why. She had the grief of someone waiting for an answer that the official investigation was not producing. She had to call Detective Apple and listen to updates that were really updates about the absence of progress. She had to keep living in a world that kept moving forward while her own world was frozen in the question of what happened to Greg. The decision to hire Ken Brennan was not just a practical decision. It was an act of will. It was Susie saying, "I am not going to accept this. I am not going to let Greg's death be an unsolved mystery. I am going to do everything in my power to find the answer, even if the official investigation cannot." That decision required courage, because bringing in a private investigator on top of an active police investigation is not a simple thing. It requires navigating the sensitivities of law enforcement professionals who may or may not be comfortable with an outsider looking over their shoulder. It requires resources. A private investigator of Ken Brennan's caliber and experience does not come cheaply. And it requires the emotional stamina to keep pushing into the wound when everything in you wants to let it close, to keep asking questions when the answers keep not coming, to stay engaged with the details of your husband's death when disengaging would be so much easier. Susie Flanagan had that stamina, and because she had it, justice happened. Ken Brennan himself has spoken publicly about this case, and about why it became one of the cases he remembers most clearly from his career. In a landscape of cold cases and complicated investigations, what distinguished this one was the nature of the mystery itself. Most murders, when the initial confusion is stripped away, follow recognizable patterns. There is a motive, even if it takes time to identify. There is a method, even if it takes time to reconstruct. There is a connection between the perpetrator and the victim, even if that connection is initially hidden. The Greg Flanagan case was unusual precisely because none of those recognizable patterns applied. There was no motive, because the shooter had no connection to the victim. There was no traceable method, because the method had passed through a wall and left its evidence hidden inside the body of a dead man. There was no connection between the perpetrator and the victim, because they were genuinely strangers who happened to be adjacent to each other on a Wednesday night in a Texas hotel. The solution came not from following a trail of connections between people, but from following the physics of the event. From asking, given the injuries, given the scene, given the behavior of the victim in his last moments, what actually happened here? And then following that question through every clue that the evidence could provide, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly irrelevant. The cigarette, the temperature, the circuit breaker, the trajectory, the toothpaste. None of these clues were dramatic in themselves. None of them were the kind of thing that shows up in the first 10 minutes of a forensic investigation. They were the residue of a night that had gone catastrophically wrong, scattered around a hotel room like breadcrumbs, waiting for someone patient enough to follow them all the way to the end. Brennan has said that the cigarette clue was the one that changed his understanding of the case. Not because it told him who killed Greg, but because it told him something about how Greg died. It told him that Greg had been upright and moving at the moment he was struck, which meant the strike had come from a direction he was moving away from. That was a physical constraint that narrowed the possibilities enormously. You cannot be moving away from something and be struck by a human assailant coming from that same direction without there being physical evidence of that assailant. Footprints, disturbed furniture, the physical marks of two people's bodies moving through a confined space together. There was none of that evidence. So the force that had killed Greg had not been delivered by a person physically present in the room. It had come from somewhere else. It had traveled through space. And the only way a lethal force travels through space in that way without a visible delivery mechanism is as a projectile, as a bullet. Once Brennan had that framework, everything else fell into place. Not quickly. These things never happen quickly in reality, despite the compressed timelines that television has conditioned us to expect, but inexorably. Each clue pointed toward the next. The temperature led to the circuit breaker. The circuit breaker established the timeline. The timeline connected the events in room 348 to the events in room 349 in a way that had not previously been visible. And the wall search produced the whole, and the whole produced the trajectory, and the trajectory produced the revised understanding of the autopsy, and the revised autopsy produced the confirmation of what had been suspected all along. Greg Flanagan was killed by a bullet fired from the next room. Everything else, the confession, the recorded call, the arrest, the prosecution, flowed from that discovery. There is something almost mathematical about the way Brennan worked this case. A quality of pure logical deduction applied to human and physical evidence in a way that felt almost clinical. And yet the case itself was anything but clinical. The case was deeply human. It was about a man who went to work every week and loved his wife, and had a room he always stayed in, and a movie he was watching, and a root beer on the nightstand. It was about the randomness of violence, about the terrifying way in which ordinary life can be shattered by someone else's carelessness. It was about the courage of a widow who refused to let her husband's death go unanswered. And it was about the men in room 349 who made a choice that compounded the original tragedy, to stay silent while Susie Flanagan suffered. Let us talk about that choice for a moment, because it is important, because it is the part of the story that many people find hardest to understand. How do you do that? How do you sit in a hotel room and hear the commotion starting next door and know, with absolute certainty, that you are the reason for it? How do you watch a body being removed from a room that your bullet traveled into, and say nothing? How do you go home to your family, your normal life, your daily routines, and carry that with you? How do you respond to police questioning with the composure of someone who has nothing to hide? How do you say nothing when a $50,000 reward is announced, and Susie Flanagan's face is on the news, and the investigation is clearly agonizing everyone connected to Greg? There is no good answer to those questions. There are psychological explanations: fear, denial, the way that group silence reinforces individual silence, the way that each day of saying nothing makes it progressively harder to speak, because the lie has grown bigger and more complicated, and the consequences of speaking seem to have grown as well. There are explanations rooted in self-preservation, in the very human and very understandable terror of facing the legal and social consequences of what had happened. None of these explanations justify the choice. They simply describe it. And the consequence of that choice, for the people who made it, was that what might have been treated as a terrible accident, a tragic outcome of criminal negligence, the kind of thing that might have resulted in serious charges but might also have had access to some measure of mercy given the absence of intent, became something worse. It became a cover-up. It became months of compounded dishonesty that added their own weight to the original act and made the men responsible for it look not just negligent but contemptible. They had not just killed Greg Flanagan. They had denied Susie Flanagan the truth for months. And that was a choice they made deliberately, every single day, every single time they did not pick up the phone. Now, as the investigation moved toward its conclusion, that choice was going to have consequences. Lance Mueller was going to face what he had done, and Susie Flanagan was finally going to get to speak. But first, the legal process had to run its course. And the legal process, in cases like this one, is always complicated, because the question of what charges fit what actually happened is not always as simple as the narrative of the events might suggest. Mueller had not intended to kill Greg Flanagan. The evidence was clear on that. There was no premeditation. There was no design. There was no moment at which Mueller had looked at a wall and decided to shoot the person on the other side of it. What there was, instead, was a man who had consumed alcohol and picked up a loaded firearm and behaved with it in a way that was reckless beyond any reasonable standard, and in doing so had caused the death of another human being. That is not murder in the legal sense in which most people use the word. That is manslaughter, criminal negligence resulting in death. And the question of what sentence was appropriate for that manslaughter, given the context of the cover-up, given the months of silence, given the suffering that silence had caused to Susie Flanagan and to everyone else who had loved Greg, that was a question that the legal system was going to have to wrestle with. The charges were brought. The evidence was laid out. And Lance Mueller, confronted with the physical evidence, the witness testimony, the recorded phone call, and the full reconstruction of what had happened in room 349 on September 15, 2010, faced a choice of his own. He could contest the charges and go to trial, forcing Susie Flanagan and the investigators and everyone else connected to the case to go through the long and grinding process of a full courtroom proceeding. Or he could accept responsibility. He could look at the evidence arrayed against him and make the decision that at least some part of him knew was the only honest decision available. He pleaded no contest to manslaughter, and the sentencing hearing came, and Susie Flanagan stood up. The courtroom on the day of sentencing was not the kind of dramatic scene that television legal dramas have conditioned us to expect. There were no surprise revelations. There was no last-minute twist. The question of what had happened to Greg Flanagan had been answered. The question of who was responsible had been answered. The question of what the legal system was going to do about it was being answered today. What remained, what the sentencing hearing was actually for, beyond the formal imposition of consequences, was the human part. The part that could not be captured in evidence files and autopsy reports and bullet trajectory analyses. The part that was about Greg Flanagan as a person, and what his death had cost the people who loved him, and what it meant for the man who was responsible for it to sit in that room and hear those costs enumerated by the people who had borne them. Victim impact statements are one of the few places in the legal process where the formality of procedure gives way to something more raw and more human. They are the moment when the legal system acknowledges that the harm done by a crime extends beyond the victim's body and into the lives of everyone connected to them. They are the moment when the grieving widow gets to stop being a background figure in someone else's story and stand at the front of the room and speak directly to the person who altered her life. And Susie Flanagan had things to say. She had been carrying this for more than a year. She had been carrying Greg's absence, and the confusion of not knowing, and the long months of investigation, and the slow and painful emergence of the truth, and all of the complicated emotions that come with finally getting an answer that explains everything and resolves nothing. Because here is the thing about getting an answer in a case like Greg's: it does not bring him back. It does not restore what was taken. It does not change the fact that Greg Flanagan sat in his hotel room on a Wednesday evening watching Iron Man 2 and never came home. The answer explains the how, but it does not address the why in any way that soothes the wound. The why, the real why, the existential why, the why that Susie had probably asked herself 10,000 times in the months since Greg's death. The why of why Greg, why that room, why that night, why her husband instead of someone else. That why does not have an answer that makes sense. That is the kind of why that has no answer. And Susie Flanagan was going to have to find a way to live with that for the rest of her life. But she could say this. She could stand in that courtroom and say this to the man who was sitting there, who had pulled a trigger in a hotel room in Beaumont, Texas, and changed her life forever, and then said nothing about it for months. She could say what it had been like. She could say what he had taken. And she did. She looked at Lance Mueller and she told him that Greg Flanagan had been her partner in everything. That he had been the steady center of her daily life. The person she called and texted and came home to and built her days around. She told him about the last message, "You're doing good, babe," and what it meant to her now, knowing that it was the last thing Greg ever said to her. She told him about the months of not knowing, about the grief that had no explanation attached to it, about what it was like to bury your husband without understanding what had killed him. She told him about Detective Apple and Ken Brennan and the long road that had eventually led to this room. And she told him that the road had been so long because he had made it long. She told him that the accident might have been an accident, but everything that came after the accident was a choice. And she made clear, in the language of a woman who had thought about this for a very long time, that she understood the difference between the two. And then she said the line that has stayed with everyone who heard this case, the line that has been quoted and shared and remembered because it captures something true in a way that nothing else in the story does. She said to Lance Mueller, "You didn't intentionally seek him out, but you murdered him with every lie you told." Take a moment with that. Let it sit. She was not saying that Mueller had committed murder in the legal sense. The law had already determined that the appropriate charge was manslaughter, and she understood that distinction. She was saying something more specific and more cutting. She was saying that what happened in room 349 on September 15th, 2010, might have been an accident. But what happened afterward was not an accident. The silence was not an accident. The toothpaste was not an accident. The months of Susie Flanagan not knowing who had killed her husband were not an accident. Those were deliberate. Those were choices that Mueller and the others made, actively, repeatedly, every day that they woke up and decided to stay silent. And those choices had their own consequences, separate from and in addition to the original act. Those choices had killed something in Susie Flanagan that the bullet itself had not reached. They had killed her ability to grieve with clarity. They had delayed and complicated and poisoned her process of coming to terms with what had happened. And she named that. She put it in front of Mueller, and she named it clearly. You murdered him with every lie. The sentence that Lance Mueller received was 10 years in prison. 10 years. And when you hear that number in the context of everything that happened, the death, the cover-up, the months of silence, the suffering of Susie Flanagan, there is an instinct to feel that it is not enough. That feeling is understandable. The life of Greg Flanagan, a good man, a hard-working man, a devoted husband who had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. That life, by any human measure of value, is worth more than 10 years of someone else's freedom. The mathematics of criminal sentencing will never produce an equation that satisfies the emotional reality of what was lost. And yet the legal system is not designed to produce satisfaction in that sense. It is designed to impose proportionate consequences in the context of what actually happened. And what actually happened, legally, was manslaughter, criminal negligence, not premeditated murder. 10 years was within the range of what the law prescribed for what Mueller had done and then covered up. Whether it was enough is not a question the legal system can fully answer. It is a question that lives in Susie Flanagan, and in everyone who loved Greg, and in everyone who has heard this story and sat with the weight of it. And perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it is simply this: justice was imperfect, as it usually is. But justice happened. The truth came out. The lie was exposed. The men who had stayed silent were made to face what they had hidden. And Susie Flanagan, who had refused to accept the silence, who had hired a private investigator and pushed and kept pushing until the answer was found, Susie got to stand in that room and say what she needed to say. That is not nothing. In the landscape of grief and loss and the incomplete consolations that justice can offer, that is not nothing at all. Now, having followed this case from Greg's last evening watching a movie to Susie's words in the courtroom, it is worth stepping back and thinking about what this story means. What does it tell us? Because true crime, at its best, is not entertainment purely. It is not just a vehicle for suspense and revelation, though it is those things too. At its best, true crime illuminates something about the world we live in, about the fragility of safety, about the way ordinary lives can be shattered by forces that have nothing to do with the choices those lives have made, about the nature of accountability and the machinery of justice, and what it means to pursue the truth when the truth has been deliberately buried. The Greg Flanagan case illustrates, perhaps more vividly than most, the terrifying randomness that underlies a certain category of violent death. Greg was not targeted. He was not the victim of a plan. He was simply in a room that shared a wall with another room at the wrong moment, in the path of a bullet fired by a drunk man who was careless with a weapon. The geographical accident of his hotel room assignment, room 348 rather than a different room, on a floor where electricians were staying rather than on a different floor, that is what determined his fate on September 15, 2010. Not anything he did, not anything he was, just the room number on his key card. That randomness is disturbing in a particular way. We like to believe that the world is comprehensible in the sense that consequences connect to causes in traceable ways. We like to believe that if we are careful, if we are good people, if we avoid unnecessary risks and stay out of dangerous situations and treat others well, that we are safe. And most of the time, that belief is not entirely wrong. Most of the time, the choices we make do bear some relationship to the outcomes we experience. But cases like Greg Flanagan's remind us that the relationship is not perfect, that sometimes the universe does not honor the contract we think we have with it, that a good man can be sitting in his hotel room watching a movie, completely safe by any reasonable measure, and something can come through the wall and end his life. That is a hard thing to carry, and yet it is true. What we can take from this story, the thing that feels earned rather than falsely consoling, is the example of the people who refuse to accept the randomness as the final word. Susie Flanagan, who would not let grief be enough, who demanded an answer. Ken Brennan, who looked at an impossibility and saw a puzzle instead. Detective Apple, who stayed with the case even when it seemed to be going nowhere, who brought Brennan in when he recognized he needed a fresh set of eyes. These people did not change what happened to Greg. They could not. But they changed what happened after. They changed the answer from nothing to something. They changed the outcome from an unsolved cold case file to a courtroom, a sentence, a confession, a moment of truth. And maybe that is what we are really here for, on nights like this one. Not just to hear the story, but to think about what it means to be the kind of person who doesn't give up. The kind of person who, when the official channels have stalled and the easy paths have been exhausted, finds another way. Susie Flanagan found another way. And because she did, the truth came out. If you are still with me right now, and I think you are, because this story has not finished giving you things to think about, I want to ask you to do one small thing. Before we go any further into the details of what came after, before we explore the full scope of what the investigation revealed about how cases like this one get solved and what we can learn from them, take a second and hit that like button. Not for me, for Greg. For the cases like his that deserve to be known. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. We are only partway through tonight, and the best is still ahead. Let us go deeper into the mechanics of what Ken Brennan actually did, because the investigation deserves more than a surface-level treatment. The broad strokes, the cigarette, the temperature, the bullet hole, the toothpaste, are compelling as a narrative. But the details of how Brennan moved through the evidence, the specific thought processes that led him from one clue to the next, those details tell a story about forensic investigation that is worth understanding. Because this is not just a story about one case. It is a story about how all cases get solved. About what it actually takes to see what other people have missed. When Brennan first sat down with the case file, he imposed a discipline on himself that experienced investigators describe as essential, and that most people find genuinely difficult to maintain. He tried not to have a theory. Or more precisely, he tried to arrive at a theory only after the evidence had told him what it had to say, rather than approaching the evidence with a pre-existing theory and looking for confirmation. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious in practice. When you read a murder case file, your brain immediately starts generating explanations. It is the natural human response to a puzzle. You start building pictures, you start connecting dots, you start seeing patterns. And the patterns your brain generates are heavily influenced by what you already know, what you have seen before, what kinds of cases you have worked. The danger is that the theory becomes more real to you than the evidence. That you start reading the evidence as confirmation of the theory rather than as independent data that may or may not support any particular explanation. Good investigators resist this. They hold their theories lightly. They are willing to build a theory and then throw it away when the next piece of evidence doesn't fit. They are willing to be wrong, repeatedly and without embarrassment, because being wrong is the process by which you get to being right. Brennan had spent enough time in law enforcement and private investigation to have learned this discipline, and he applied it to the Flanagan case with a rigor that the case required. The first thing he did was look at the scene from a purely physical perspective, setting aside everything he knew about the victim's character, the initial investigation's conclusions, and the absence of obvious evidence. He looked at the crime scene photographs as spatial documents. He looked at where Greg's body was positioned, not next to the bed, not at the window, not in the bathroom, but between the bed and the door, closer to the door than to the bed. He thought about what that positioning meant. A person who dies of a heart attack or stroke most commonly dies where they are when the event occurs, in the bed, or in the chair, or wherever they are sitting or lying. They do not typically travel halfway across a room first, because the events that cause natural cardiac or cerebrovascular death do not generally begin with a period of upright ambulation. They strike you where you are. But Greg was between the bed and the door, which meant Greg had been moving, which meant something had happened, some event, some stimulus, some physical experience that had gotten him to his feet and sent him toward the door. And when you combine that with the cigarette in the wrong hand, you get a specific narrative of Greg's last moments that is physical and spatial and real. He was in bed. Something hit him. The shock, the instinct to get help or to get out, got him to his feet. He was moving toward the door. He did not make it. From there, Brennan thought about what kind of something could produce the internal injuries documented in the autopsy while generating no external evidence visible to the first people to enter the room. This is where the leap of intuition, if you can call it that Brennan made was most significant. Because the conclusion that the injuries were consistent with a projectile rather than a physical assault required overriding a very strong initial impression. The initial impression, shared by the first responders and the initial investigators, was that Greg had not been shot, because there was no bullet wound, because the medical examiner had not found one, because nobody had heard a gunshot, because there was no weapon. All of those things are powerful inhibitors to the conclusion that someone was shot. And yet Brennan followed the logic past those inhibitors, not by dismissing them, but by asking whether they were actually as definitive as they appeared. The absence of a bullet wound in the initial examination, was that definitively conclusive? Medical examiners are extremely skilled, but they are also human, and they examine bodies with a set of expectations about what they are looking for based on the information they have been given about the circumstances of death. If the initial information suggested probable natural causes or possible assault, the examination proceeds with those frameworks in mind. The examination looks for what it expects to find. If there is a bullet wound that is not immediately obvious, one located in an area of the body that is not routinely the first focus of a trauma examination, one where the wound characteristics are subtle because of the nature of the injury, it is possible for it to be missed. Not because the medical examiner is incompetent, but because the search was calibrated for different findings. Brennan held that possibility. He did not assume the initial examination had been perfect. He kept open the idea that a bullet wound existed and had been missed. The absence of a heard gunshot. Was that definitively conclusive? People consistently underestimate how difficult it is to identify a single gunshot in an occupied building as a gunshot. The acoustic characteristics of a gunshot indoors vary enormously depending on the caliber of the weapon, the construction of the room, the ambient noise level, and the state of alertness and attention of the people who might hear it. A 9mm round discharged inside a hotel room shares a wall with another hotel room may produce a sound that is loud within the room of origin but attenuated significantly by the time it passes through the wall. It may be heard by neighbors as a loud bang, a sharp crack, something that registers briefly and then is incorporated into the ambient noise of a busy hotel, a door slamming, someone dropping something. Unless the hearer is already on high alert for gunfire, unless the sound is repeated, unless it is followed by other sounds of alarm or distress, a single gunshot can pass unremarked. Brennan held that possibility too. And the absence of a weapon, that was, of course, not evidence that a weapon had not been used. It was evidence that a weapon was not present in the room, which meant either the weapon had been removed or the weapon had never been in the room. If the shot had come from the next room, if the weapon had been discharged in room 349 rather than room 348, then the absence of a weapon in room 348 was not just consistent with the bullet through the wall theory. It was expected. Of course, there was no weapon in room 348. The weapon had never been there. Step by step, clue by clue, Brennan followed the thread through the evidence until the physical reality of what had happened became clear. And then he went to the hotel room itself, and he stood in the space where Greg had died, and he made the physical evidence confirm what the documentary evidence had suggested. The wall search was the final step. The toothpaste was the confirmation. The trajectory analysis completed the picture. There is a term that investigators sometimes use for this kind of work: the careful, patient, back-to-basics approach to a cold case that treats every previous assumption as potentially wrong and rebuilds the understanding of the case from the ground up. Some people call it fresh eyes investigation. Some people call it scene reconstruction. Whatever you call it, it requires a quality that is harder to teach than technical forensic skill. It requires the ability to tolerate uncertainty without filling the gap with false confidence. It requires the discipline to stay with not knowing long enough for the evidence to produce knowing, rather than short-circuiting that process with a premature conclusion. Ken Brennan had that quality, and the Greg Flanagan case is a textbook example of why it matters. The case also illustrates something about the nature of cold case investigation more broadly. Cold cases go cold for specific reasons, and understanding those reasons is the first step to reopening them. In the Greg Flanagan case, the primary reason the case went cold was that the initial investigation was asking the wrong question. The initial investigation was asking, who attacked Greg Flanagan? Who came into his room and beat him to death? And because the answer to that question was nobody, because nobody had come into the room and attacked Greg, the investigation kept finding nothing, because it was looking for something that had not happened. The right question, the question that Brennan eventually asked, was, what mechanism produced these injuries in the absence of any visible assault? And once that was the question, the answer became available. Not immediately, not easily, but available. The evidence was there the entire time. The cigarette was there. The temperature anomaly was there. The circuit breaker record was there. The toothpaste was there, hidden in plain sight on the wall of a hotel room. None of those things disappeared while the investigation was going cold. They were waiting for someone to ask the right question. How many cold cases are sitting in evidence rooms and filing cabinets and case management systems right now, waiting for someone to ask the right question? How many families are living with the same uncertainty that Susie Flanagan lived with, waiting for a Ken Brennan to come along and see what everyone else has missed? These are not comfortable questions, but they are important ones. And the Flanagan case suggests that some of those families, if they have the resources, if they have the perseverance, if they have access to the right people, might get the answer they are waiting for. The cases are solvable if you approach them correctly. The evidence is there if you ask the right questions. Now, as we move toward the latter part of this story, there are a few more threads to follow. We have talked about Greg, about Susie, about Brennan, about Mueller. But the story of this case does not end with the sentencing hearing. The story of this case continues to reverberate because it has become, in the years since the sentencing, a teaching case, a reference point for investigators and forensic professionals and criminal justice educators who study cold case methodology. It has been discussed in the context of firearm safety, of hotel security protocols, of the responsibilities that come with carrying a loaded weapon. And it has become a story that people like you and me return to again and again, because it captures something true about randomness and loss and the way that justice, when it finally arrives, can never fully repair what was broken. Let us think about Lance Mueller for a moment. Not to humanize him in a way that diminishes what he did or how he compounded it, but because understanding him, understanding what kind of person gets into the situation he got into and makes the choices he made, is part of understanding the full story. Mueller was not a career criminal. He was not a violent man in the way that the word violent is commonly used. He was a working man, an electrician, someone with a life and presumably people in his life who cared about him. He had a 9mm pistol, which in Texas and in the trades culture he was part of was not unusual. And he got drunk one night, and he played with that weapon in a way that was catastrophically irresponsible, and a bullet went through a wall and killed an innocent man. The thing about that scenario, the thing that makes it genuinely difficult to process, is how preventable it was. At every step, there were decision points where a different choice would have changed everything. Mueller could have left the gun at home. Mueller could have not drunk to the point of impairment. Mueller could have kept the gun secured while drinking. Mueller could have not taken it out. Mueller could have not pointed it at people. Mueller could have not pulled the trigger. Any one of those choices, differently made, and Greg Flanagan is still alive. Any one of them. The number of decision points at which the catastrophe could have been averted is both striking and painful, because it underscores what a waste the whole thing was. Not just Greg's death. That was a waste of a life, a profound and irreplaceable waste, but the choices that led to it. The careless, avoidable chain of decisions that ended in a hotel room in Beaumont, Texas, on a Wednesday night in September. And then there was the cover-up. Because if the shooting was the tragedy, the cover-up was the choice that transformed a tragedy into something more deliberately wrong. And we need to spend more time there. We need to understand, as fully as we can, what it means to cover up an accidental death, what it requires, what it costs, and what it says about the people who do it. In the immediate aftermath of the shot, the room was filled with shock. That is almost certainly true. Whatever the precise circumstances, however drunk they were, however confused the moment was, the men in room 349 knew that a gun had just fired and the bullet had gone through the wall. They knew that. And the silence that followed the shot, the silence coming from room 348, the complete and total absence of any sound of response or alarm from the other side of the wall, that silence should have told them something. Because if you fire a bullet through a hotel wall and nobody on the other side reacts, there are two possibilities. Either the bullet hit nothing and nobody, and there is nothing to be done about it except deal with the property damage. Or the bullet hit someone, and that person cannot respond, and what you are hearing is not peaceful silence but the silence of someone who can no longer make sound. Did they know? In those first moments, did they understand what they had done? That question is impossible to answer with certainty, because only the men in room 349 know what was said and thought in those minutes after the shot. What we know is what they did. They took toothpaste from the bathroom, and they filled the hole, and they stayed quiet. And the next morning, when the investigation began in the corridor, they observed it with the knowledge of what they had done, and they said nothing. The decision to cover up rather than come forward is a decision that people make for a variety of reasons, and almost all of those reasons are rooted in fear. Fear of prosecution, fear of professional consequences, fear of losing their families and their livelihoods, fear of the social shame that attaches to being the person responsible for someone's death, even accidentally. These fears are real. They are understandable in the sense that fear is always understandable as a human experience. But they do not justify the choice that was made, because the choice that was made had a victim. The victim of the cover-up was not the legal system. It was not abstract justice. It was Susie Flanagan, who sat at home in Louisiana without an explanation for why her husband was dead. Every day of the cover-up was a day of suffering for Susie. Every day of silence was a day added to the period during which she had to exist in the terrible liminal space of unexplained grief. When Tim Steinmetz eventually confessed, part of what he communicated was the weight of that silence. The cover-up had not been comfortable. Living with the knowledge of what had happened had not been easy. There had been conversations, presumably, among the men who had been in room 349 that night, about what to do, about whether to speak, about what the consequences would be. And those conversations, whatever form they took, had resulted in a sustained decision to maintain the silence. Each of them had continued to choose silence, day after day, for months. And the fact that Steinmetz eventually broke, the fact that when Brennan created the right conditions for the truth to emerge, it came out, suggests that the silence had been costing Steinmetz something. Suggests that carrying the knowledge of what they had done had not been the uncomplicated, burden-free experience that people who are described as getting away with something are sometimes imagined to have. There is a psychological literature on what is called moral injury, the particular kind of psychological damage that occurs when a person acts in a way that violates their own moral framework. It is distinct from guilt, though it involves guilt. It is the damage done to the self-concept when you become, through your actions, a kind of person you did not think you were. The men in room 349 had presumably not thought of themselves as people who would cover up a death. They had presumably not sat down before September 15, 2010, and made a conscious decision that if something terrible happened on their watch, they would stay silent and let a widow suffer without answers. That was not the self-concept they had walked into that hotel room with. But it became what they did. And for at least one of them, for Tim Steinmetz, who eventually talked, the gap between what they had done and who they thought they were had never entirely closed. This is not an argument for sympathy. It is an observation about human psychology, about the way that terrible choices compound their damage not just outward, into the lives of the people who are hurt by them, but inward, into the psychological and moral architecture of the people who make them. The cover-up did not protect the men in room 349 from consequences. It merely deferred the consequences, and in the interim, it cost them something that no legal sentence could restore. It cost them the version of themselves they might have been if they had chosen differently. If they had knocked on the door of room 348 that night and found Greg in distress and called for help. If they had called 911 and said what had happened. If they had told the truth in the immediate, unguarded chaos of the moment, when the truth was still fresh and uncontested and the opportunity to be honest was still fully open. They did not take that opportunity, and the version of themselves that would have taken it ceased to be available to them the moment they reached for the toothpaste. The broader question this case raises, a question that is relevant far beyond the specifics of a hotel room in Beaumont, Texas, is the question of responsibility in the context of accidental harm. When does an accident become a crime? The legal system has a fairly clear answer to this question in terms of statutes and definitions, but the moral answer is more complicated. Mueller's use of the weapon that night was criminally negligent by any reasonable standard. He was intoxicated. He was pointing a loaded firearm at people. He pulled the trigger. Whether the discharge was fully intentional, whether he consciously chose to fire the weapon, or whether it was the result of impaired motor control and impaired judgment resulting in a trigger pull that a sober person would not have made, the outcome was the same. A man was dead because Mueller had been reckless with a lethal weapon. But then there are the months of cover-up. The deliberate, sustained, day-by-day choice to maintain the silence. The refusal to come forward even when the reward was announced and the investigation was clearly causing ongoing pain to the victim's family. That is not negligence. That is not an accident of judgment or a failure of impulse control. That is a decision, made deliberately and repeatedly, to prioritize personal safety over the truth. And Susie Flanagan's words captured this distinction precisely. The shooting might have been an accident. The lying was not. Let us also think about what the Flanagan case tells us about the culture surrounding firearms. This is not a politically charged observation. It is simply a factual one. The conditions that made Greg Flanagan's death possible were: a man had a loaded handgun in a hotel room, that man was intoxicated, and that man handled the weapon carelessly. Those three conditions are not unusual. They occur more frequently than the general public tends to assume. The specific outcome, a bullet through a wall and into an innocent person in the next room, was, in this particular instance, fatal. In other instances, in other hotel rooms and apartments and houses, similar conditions produce near misses that are never reported, never documented, never becoming part of the record that might otherwise encourage a more serious conversation about responsible firearm storage and handling. The Greg Flanagan case became visible because Greg died. How many cases like it? Cases where carelessness with a loaded weapon almost ended a life, remained invisible because the bullet missed. These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions that this story is positioned to resolve, but they are questions that the story asks, simply by existing. And stories that ask important questions, even when they cannot answer them, have value. They create the space in which the questions can be considered. And considering them, really considering them, not just as abstract policy debates, but as human realities connected to actual people who were harmed or almost harmed, is part of what makes stories like Greg Flanagan's matter beyond their dramatic content. The case has also been discussed extensively in the context of hotel security. The question of what responsibility hotels have to their guests for the safety of their rooms, including the safety of the shared walls and the adequacy of soundproofing and physical separation between adjacent rooms, is one that the hospitality industry has grappled with in various forms for years. The Greg Flanagan case presents an extreme version of this question because the harm was not caused by a failure of the hotel's security systems in any conventional sense. The hotel did not fail to lock a door or monitor a suspicious person. The hotel was simply a building in which rooms shared walls, as all hotel rooms do. And the bullets of careless people do not stop at the legal boundary between one room and the next. What the hotel could have done, what any hotel can do, is limited by the fundamental physics of building construction. Drywall does not stop bullets. Even concrete does not reliably stop bullets. There is no construction standard that makes a hotel room completely impervious to a projectile discharged in the adjacent room. This is a physical reality, not a failing of the hospitality industry specifically. But it is a reality that most hotel guests do not think about when they check in, settle into their room, and proceed to feel safe within the four walls around them. The Greg Flanagan case is a reminder, stark, terrible, and indelible, that the walls around you are not the guarantee of safety that they feel like. That the people on the other side of those walls are an unknown quantity. That the quiet of a hotel corridor at night is not evidence of the quiet of the rooms behind the closed doors. This is not an argument for anxiety. Most hotel rooms, on most nights, are perfectly safe. The overwhelming majority of hotel guests spend their nights in those rooms without incident, without danger, without anything more threatening than a difficult mattress or a too cold air conditioner. The Greg Flanagan case is exceptional, not representative. But exceptional cases have a way of crystallizing truths that are always present, but usually invisible. And the truth this case crystallizes is about the fragility of the ordinary, about the way that safety is never absolute, about the way that the events of one person's night can reach through a wall and alter the events of another person's night without warning, without announcement, without giving the second person any opportunity to protect themselves. And perhaps the most honest thing you can do with that truth is simply hold it. Not as a source of fear, not as a reason to never stay in a hotel or never trust the walls around you, but as a reminder of what actually matters in the time that you have, of what it means to send a message to the person you love, as Greg Flanagan did on the last night of his life, and mean it completely, of what it means to be present for the people who are present for you. Because you cannot know when a Wednesday evening is actually the last evening. You cannot know when the movie on the television is the last movie. You cannot know when the message you send is the last message. You're doing good, babe. Greg said that to Susie on the last night of his life. He said it without knowing it would be the last thing. He said it simply because it was true, because he meant it, because he was the kind of man who said what he meant to the people he loved without waiting for a special occasion or a moment of crisis to make the feeling feel urgent enough to express. He just said it. And Susie has carried those words with her ever since. Not as a weight, as a gift, as the last piece of Greg she will ever have, small and ordinary and completely sufficient for everything it needs to be. Ken Brennan has given interviews over the years in which he has discussed the Flanagan case in terms that reveal something about what this kind of work does to a person. Private investigation, particularly the cold case work that Brennan specialized in, is not a job that stays at the office. It follows you. The cases follow you. The faces of the victims follow you. And the faces of the families. The people who come to you not as clients in a purely transactional sense, but as people who need something from you that the rest of the world has been unable to provide. Those faces follow you most of all. Susie Flanagan was one of those faces. Brennan has spoken about the quality of her determination, about what it was like to sit across from a woman who was grieving and simultaneously fighting, who had refused to let the grief be the whole story. He has spoken about the way that kind of determination changes the dynamic of an investigation. Because when the person who brought you into a case refuses to give up, it becomes impossible for you to give up either. Their resolution becomes your resolution. Their need for an answer becomes your need for an answer. The case is no longer an intellectual puzzle to be solved in isolation. It is a human obligation to be honored. This matters because the Flanagan case, at several points, could have been set aside. There were moments in Brennan's investigation when the evidence was not yet clear, when the next step was not yet obvious, when the most rational response to the available information would have been to acknowledge the difficulty and wait. Brennan did not wait. He kept pressing. He kept asking questions. He kept standing in that hotel room and looking at the walls and thinking about what had happened there. And the reason he kept doing that was partly professional discipline and partly something more personal. The sense of obligation he felt to the woman who had hired him and to the man whose face was in the case file photographs. There is something worth saying here about the nature of private investigation versus official law enforcement investigation. The two approaches are complementary. They serve different functions and operate under different constraints. And this case illustrates both the limitations of one and the strengths of the other. Official law enforcement investigations have resources that private investigators do not have. They have subpoena power, forensic laboratories, the authority to compel testimony and preserve evidence and make arrests. Detective Apple and the Beaumont Police Department brought all of those resources to the Flanagan case and worked it as professionally as the evidence allowed. The case did not go cold because of any failure of effort or professionalism on the part of the official investigation. It went cold because the evidence, as initially presented, pointed toward nothing. The investigation could not find what was not visible. What Brennan brought to the case was not greater resources. It was a different kind of freedom. He was not bound by the same institutional pressures that shape official investigations. The need to demonstrate progress, the resource constraints that require cases to compete with other cases for attention, the procedural frameworks that are designed to protect against bias and error, but that can also create rigidity. Brennan could ask questions that the official investigation had not asked because the official investigation had not had a reason to ask them. He could follow intuitions that the official investigation might have regarded as too speculative. He could stand in a hotel room and say, "I think I know how he died," without having to justify that statement to a supervisor or a review board. That freedom, the freedom to think outside the established parameters of the investigation, was what allowed him to ask the question about the bullet and to search the wall and to find the toothpaste. The collaboration between Brennan and Detective Apple is also noteworthy because it was not guaranteed to work. Bringing a private investigator into an active homicide investigation can create tension. Official investigators sometimes feel their authority is being questioned or their competence is being implied as insufficient when a private investigator is brought in. That is a human response to a potentially difficult situation. But Apple handled it differently. He recognized that Brennan's fresh perspective was valuable, not as a criticism of the official investigation, but as a compliment to it. He worked with Brennan. He shared information. He accompanied Brennan to the hotel room. He was present for the discovery of the bullet hole. He brought the full weight of his official authority to bear in support of what Brennan's independent investigation had identified. That collaborative approach is part of why the case got solved. Neither of them could have done it alone. The dynamics of that collaboration are something that criminal justice educators have pointed to in discussions of how cold case investigations should be structured. The ideal is exactly what happened in the Flanagan case. An official investigation that remains the primary authority over the case, combined with independent input from someone with a fresh perspective and different constraints, with both parties working toward the same goal rather than competing with each other. That kind of collaboration requires both parties to have a certain kind of ego flexibility, a willingness to acknowledge that they do not have all the answers, and that the answers might come from an unexpected direction. Apple had that flexibility. Brennan had the perspective. Together, they built the case. Now, there is another aspect of this story that has not yet been fully explored, and it concerns the forensic reconstruction of the shooting. Because once the bullet hole had been found and the trajectory had been identified, the investigators needed to produce a physical reconstruction of the path the bullet had taken, from wherever Mueller was standing in room 349 when the gun fired, through the wall, through the space of room 348, and into Greg Flanagan's body. This reconstruction served multiple purposes. It confirmed that the trajectory was physically consistent with what had been theorized. It allowed the specific entry point on Greg's body to be identified and matched to the entry wound that had been missed in the initial autopsy examination. And it created a documented, replicable record that could be presented in court as evidence. The details of that reconstruction are worth understanding because they illuminate why the entry wound had been so easy to miss. The shot had been fired from a point relatively low in room 349. The exact position of the weapon at the moment of discharge being determined by the angle of the hole in the wall and the corresponding mark on the other side in room 348. It had traveled at a slight upward angle, passing through the drywall, and emerging into room 348 at a height consistent with the level of the bed. Greg had been lying in the bed when the bullet struck him. He had been lying in a position, on his back, or partially on his side, in which the trajectory of the bullet intersected with the lower part of his body. The bullet had entered through the perineal area, through the scrotum, and had traveled upward through the body cavity, passing through the organs it damaged in sequence as it moved from lower to upper body. The reason this entry wound had been missed in the initial autopsy was, as suggested earlier, a function of where the wound was located and the clinical context of the initial examination. The area was not typically the focus of the initial survey of a body presented without an obvious cause of violent death. The wound itself, in an area of soft tissue that had not been subjected to the kind of blunt force trauma that produces obvious bruising and laceration, did not present with the visual characteristics that immediately flag a projectile entry wound. It was subtle enough that a rapid, preliminary examination oriented toward natural causes would not necessarily catch it. When Dr. Brown went back to the examination with specific guidance about where to look and what to look for, he found it. The subsequent legal and forensic work was thorough. Ballistic analysis connected the bullet recovered from Greg's body, because the bullet had not exited, had not passed all the way through, but had come to rest within the body cavity after completing its devastating upward path to the 9mm weapon that Mueller had been carrying. The caliber of the bullet was consistent with a 9mm round. The type of damage it had produced was consistent with the kinetic energy profile of a 9mm bullet fired at close to muzzle velocity through a relatively thin barrier. Everything fit. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation's conclusions required careful management on the part of the prosecution, because the specific charges that could be brought against Mueller and those associated with him depended on what the evidence could prove and what the law defined as criminally culpable in the circumstances. The discharge itself, the firing of the weapon, could be characterized as criminally negligent given the circumstances under which it occurred. A man who is intoxicated, who takes out a loaded firearm, who points it at people, who pulls the trigger in an environment where other people are present and proximate, is not behaving negligently in the casual, non-criminal sense of the word. He is behaving negligently in the legally significant sense, with a conscious disregard for a substantial and unjustifiable risk. That is the definition of criminal negligence in most jurisdictions. It is not murder, because murder requires intent to kill or serious bodily harm. But it is a crime, and it resulted in death, which is the definition of criminal homicide in the manslaughter category. The cover-up, the filling of the hole with toothpaste, the silence during the initial investigation, the failure to disclose what had happened, added additional legal dimensions to the case. In some jurisdictions, failing to report a death or failing to render aid after causing it can be charged separately from the underlying act. The specific charges available in this case in Texas law depended on the exact circumstances and the decisions made by the prosecution about how to pursue the strongest possible case with the available evidence. The no contest plea to manslaughter was ultimately the resolution that the legal process produced. Not a full trial, not a complete accounting of every wrong that had been committed in that hotel room and its aftermath, but an acknowledgement of criminal responsibility and the imposition of a sentence. 10 years. In the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Lance Mueller was going to serve time for the death of Greg Flanagan. It was not nothing. It was also not everything that the story demanded. That gap, between the legal consequence and the moral weight of what had happened, is a gap that the justice system creates in almost every case it handles. Because the justice system is a human institution operating under human limitations, and no human institution can fully close the gap between what happened and what should happen in consequence. The best it can do is narrow the gap as much as possible. And in this case, it narrowed the gap. For Susie Flanagan, the gap that mattered most was not the one between the sentence and her sense of justice, though that gap was real. The gap that mattered most was the one between not knowing and knowing. Between having no answer and having an answer. Between the silence that had surrounded Greg's death for more than a year and the full, documented, legally confirmed truth of what had happened to him. That gap had been closed. And closing it had required Susie's refusal to accept the silence, Brennan's skill in seeing what others had missed, Apple's willingness to collaborate, and ultimately Steinmetz's decision to speak. It had taken all of them, and it had taken more than a year. But the truth was out. Greg Flanagan's death had an explanation. His family had answers. His killer had been held accountable, imperfectly, but measurably. And Susie had stood in a courtroom and said her piece. And in doing so had said something that went beyond her own case, beyond her own grief, beyond the specific details of what had happened in room 348. She had said something that resonated with anyone who has ever waited for an answer that seemed like it might never come. Anyone who has ever refused to accept a silence that felt like an injustice. Anyone who has ever been told, implicitly or explicitly, to move on when moving on felt like a betrayal of the truth. She had said, the lies matter. The silence matters. The choice to stay quiet when the truth is yours to give. That choice has a victim too. And that, perhaps, is the most important thing this story has to say. Not about hotel rooms, or ballistics, or cold case methodology, or the Texas criminal justice system, but about the human choice that sits at the center of it. The choice that each of the men in room 349 made. Every day they woke up and decided to stay silent. And the choice that Susie Flanagan made. Every day she woke up and decided to keep pushing. Both of those things, the silence and the refusal to accept the silence, were choices. And they had consequences. And the consequences are the story. If you have been with this story from the beginning, then you have been sitting with it long enough now that it has probably started to feel personal. That is the thing that good true crime does. It starts as a story about someone else, in a place you may never have been, involving circumstances that seem initially remote from your own life. And then, gradually, it stops being remote. Gradually, the people in the story stop being strangers and start being people you recognize. Not because you know them personally, but because the emotions they experience are emotions you have experienced too. Grief, the refusal to accept an injustice, the desire for an answer, the fear of a truth that, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Every woman who has ever loved a partner and sent them off on a work trip and received a small, ordinary message back, "You're doing good, babe," and felt the warmth of it and gone on with her evening. Every one of those women understands something about Susie Flanagan that is not theoretical. It is immediate. It is visceral. It is the understanding that the ordinary is precious in a way that we do not fully recognize until it is taken. Let us spend some time now with the aftermath of this case. Not just the legal aftermath, the sentencing, the prison term, but the human aftermath. The life that Susie Flanagan has been building in the years since Greg died, in the years since the truth was found, in the years since she stood in that courtroom and said what she needed to say. Because the story does not end with the sentencing. The story ends, insofar as it ends at all, in the ongoing life of the people who survived it. Susie Flanagan has, by the accounts available from the public record and from interviews she has given over the years, channeled her experience into advocacy. This is a path that many survivors of violent crime take. Not all of them, and not without cost, but enough of them that it represents a recognizable pattern. The experience of loss, followed by the fight for justice, followed by the eventual resolution, can produce in some people a sense of purpose that they bring to broader causes connected to their experience. For Susie, that purpose has been connected to advocating for victims and families navigating the criminal justice system. For the people who are waiting for answers, who may not have the resources or the connections to hire a Ken Brennan, who may be navigating their grief without the support that Susie was eventually able to access. The specifics of how Susie has channeled this advocacy are less important than the fact of it, than the reality that this woman, who could have been broken by everything that happened to her, instead found a way to convert the experience into something outward-facing and purposeful. That conversion is not easy. It is not automatic. It does not happen simply because a person is strong or because they choose to be. It happens through a long and difficult process of integration, of finding a way to hold the grief and the anger and the knowledge of what happened alongside the need to keep living and keep participating in the world. And Susie Flanagan went through that process. There is also something to be said about the way Greg Flanagan has been remembered, because remembrance is one of the things that survivors can control when so much else is beyond their control. They cannot unlose the person. They cannot change what happened. They cannot reach back into September 2010 and put Greg on a different floor of the hotel. But they can shape how he is remembered. They can insist that his story be told fully and honestly, that he not be reduced to a case number or an autopsy report or a victim descriptor. They can tell the world who he actually was. The candy bar, the root beer, the air conditioner set cold, the weekly drive to Beaumont, the last message to his wife. They can ensure that when people hear about Greg Flanagan, they hear about a person, not just a body in a hotel room. The true crime community, that vast, devoted, sometimes overwhelming collective of people who follow cases like this one, has, at its best, an important role to play in this kind of remembrance. When a story like Greg Flanagan's is told carefully, with attention to who the victim actually was, it does something that goes beyond entertainment. It honors the life that was lost. It treats the death as meaningful, not just as a mystery to be solved, but as a consequence to be mourned. It reminds the audience that behind every cold case, and every autopsy photograph, and every detective's case file, is a person who had a last message to send, and a movie to watch, and a room in a hotel where the air conditioner ran cold. The true crime genre has its critics, and many of those criticisms are valid. The genre can exploit victims. It can sensationalize grief. It can reduce real suffering to a narrative device, a hook to keep viewers watching, a dramatic element deployed for effect rather than treated with the respect it deserves. Those are legitimate concerns, and they apply to a significant portion of what is produced under the true crime banner. But the genre also has its best practitioners, the people and projects that approach these stories with the intention of honoring the victims, of being truthful about the complexities, of asking the important questions without pretending to have easy answers. When true crime is done well, it is not just entertainment. It is a form of witness. It says, this happened. This person existed. This family suffered. And the world should know. Greg Flanagan's story is one that deserves that kind of witness. Because it is a story about so many things that matter. It is a story about the randomness of violent death, and the way that randomness defies our need for the world to be comprehensible. It is a story about the courage of a grieving wife who refused to accept the silence. It is a story about the skill and patience and dedication of the people who solved the unsolvable. And it is a story about the choices we make, all of us, in our daily lives, about how we treat the weapons that can harm others, how we behave when we have caused harm, how we respond to the knowledge that the truth is ours to give and someone else is waiting for it. Now, before we move into the final chapters of this story, I want to pause and acknowledge something. We are now deep into this narrative, and if you have been with me this far, you deserve to know that what is coming in the final section is the part that I find most powerful. We are going to return to Susie one more time, and we're going to talk about what she has said about Greg in the years since his death, not in the formal context of a courtroom victim impact statement, but in the informal context of someone describing the person they loved. And we are going to think together about what that means for all of us who are living with the ordinary. But first, if you are still watching, if you have been here through every chapter of this story, please take a second and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are right now as you watch this. Are you in bed? Are you in your kitchen? Are you driving? Tell me what Greg Flanagan's story has made you think about. Tell me who you want to call after this. Tell me what small, ordinary thing you are going to pay attention to differently because of what you heard tonight. That is the conversation I want to have with you in the comments. That is the real purpose of this whole long night we have been spending together. The details of Greg Flanagan's case have been discussed in law enforcement training contexts, specifically in the area of firearms safety and hotel security. The case has been cited as an extreme example of what can happen when someone fails to treat a loaded firearm with consistent, sober, responsible attention, regardless of the setting, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how comfortable and social the environment feels. The lesson of the case, in that context, is not complicated. A gun is a gun wherever it is. It does not become less dangerous because you are in a hotel room with people you know and trust. It does not become safer because you are relaxed, because the evening is going well, because nobody is threatening anyone. A loaded firearm in the hands of an impaired person is a loaded firearm in the hands of an impaired person, and the consequences of that can reach through walls. The case has also been cited in discussions of what is sometimes called the duty to render aid, the legal and moral obligation to help someone you have harmed, or to report harm that you have caused, even when doing so will have consequences for you. In Texas, as in most jurisdictions, there are legal requirements around reporting certain kinds of deaths, and the failure to report a death that one has caused can itself be a criminal act. Whether the specific behavior of the men in room 349, filling a hole in the wall and staying quiet, technically satisfied the elements of a criminal cover-up, or obstruction, or failure to report, is a question that the legal proceedings addressed in their own terms. But the moral question is simpler. If you have caused someone's death, even accidentally, you have an obligation to that person and to the people who love them. That obligation does not disappear because meeting it is frightening or costly. It is still there, and choosing not to meet it is a choice that carries its own weight, its own consequences, its own damage. The legal system imposed a sentence on Lance Mueller. The moral system, the internal reckoning that each of the men in room 349 has had to undertake with themselves, in whatever private hours they have spent thinking about September 15, 2010, that reckoning is ongoing and is not subject to parole or early release. It does not end when the 10-year sentence ends. It continues as long as the people carrying it are alive and capable of reflection. Whether that is a comfort or not, it is a reality. The choices we make about truth and silence follow us. But let us not end on Mueller. Let us end, as this story should end, on Greg. On who he was. On the weeks and months and years and decades of ordinary life that constituted the person who lay down in room 348 on a Wednesday evening and watched a movie and sent his wife a message and never woke up. Because Greg Flanagan deserves the ending of this story. Not Mueller, not Brennan, not the investigation, not the legal proceedings. Greg Flanagan was born in Louisiana, and he was, in every meaningful sense, a Louisiana man. Not in the flashy, touristic sense that people sometimes project onto Louisiana. Not the beads and the brass bands and the crawfish boils that show up in the cultural shorthand for the state. He was Louisiana in the quieter, more fundamental sense of a man shaped by the land and the work and the pace of a place that values steadiness over performance, that respects people who do their jobs without complaint and treat their neighbors with basic decency. He fit that description in a way that his friends and co-workers and family members have described with remarkable consistency, because the people who knew him from different parts of his life, from work, from home, from his community, all describe him in essentially the same terms. Reliable, honest, uncomplicated in the best possible way. A man who said what he meant. He had come to the oil and gas landman profession through the kind of career path that is common in the energy industry. Entry-level work that exposed him to the field, an aptitude for the detailed and methodical nature of land research, a reputation that grew over time as someone whose work could be trusted. Landmen occupy an interesting position in the energy sector. They are not engineers. They are not drilling crews. They work in offices and courthouses, mostly, poring over title documents and ownership records and lease agreements. The work requires patience and precision and a genuine interest in the puzzle of land ownership. Who owned what? When? Under what conditions? With what restrictions attached? Greg had those qualities naturally. He was good at his work because his work suited the kind of mind he had. The weekly commute to Beaumont was a function of where the work was. The oil and gas industry in southeast Texas concentrates activity around the refining and petrochemical corridor between Beaumont and Houston, and Greg's work brought him into that corridor regularly. He had been making the weekly drive long enough that it had become simply the shape of his professional life. Not a sacrifice, not a hardship, just the way things were structured. He had his hotel room. He had his routine. He had his root beer and his candy bar and his cigarettes and his television. And on Wednesday evenings he had the particular comfort of a week that was more than half over and a home that was getting closer. His relationship with Susie was, by all descriptions, the kind of partnership that people who have been together for a long time develop. Not passionate in the way that young relationships are passionate, not dramatic or high stakes, but deep and comfortable and mutually sustaining. They had built a life together over many years, the kind of life that accumulates its meaning not in grand gestures, but in the aggregate of all the small, ordinary moments. The morning coffee, the evening phone call from Beaumont, the weekend drives, the quiet dinners, the little messages that carry no particular weight individually and enormous weight cumulatively. "You're doing good, babe," is the kind of message that only means everything if it is one of thousands. If it is the one that stands alone, the one that comes out of nowhere, it would feel strange. It means what it means because it is part of a pattern, because it is one small tile in a mosaic that was years in the making. Susie has described Greg as a man who did not talk much about his feelings, but who expressed them in other ways. He showed up. He was consistent. He took care of the things that needed taking care of. When he said something kind or loving, he meant it fully, and it mattered more precisely because he did not say such things casually. He was not a man who threw compliments around. He was not a man who performed his feelings for an audience. He kept his emotional life quiet and private and real, and the people who were close to him understood that the depth of what he felt was not measured by how loudly he expressed it. Susie knew how much she was loved. She knew it not from speeches, but from the fabric of everything. And then the fabric was gone, and she had to figure out how to live without it. The process of that figuring out is something that Susie has spoken about with a candor that reflects her personality. Direct, unsentimental in tone, even when the content is deeply sentimental. Honest about the difficulty without being consumed by it. She has said that the first months after Greg's death were the hardest. Not just because of the grief itself, but because of the not knowing. Because grief, even enormous grief, can eventually find a path forward if it has the facts in front of it. Grief can orient itself around a truth and begin the long process of integration. What prevents that process? What blocks the path forward and keeps the griever stuck? Is the unanswered question. The missing piece. The why or the how that the world has not provided. Susie was stuck in that way for months. Not just sad, not just bereaved, but suspended in a kind of helpless uncertainty that grief cannot navigate through. When the truth came out, when Brennan found the bullet hole, when Steinmetz talked, when the case moved toward resolution, Susie has described feeling something that was not quite relief, because the word relief implies the lifting of a burden, and Greg's death was a burden that was not lifted by knowing the truth. It was still there. He was still gone. But the truth brought with it something that the uncertainty had not allowed her. It brought clarity. It brought the ability to understand what had happened and to place it correctly in the world. To know that Greg had not been targeted, had not been the victim of some malice directed at him specifically, had not been killed because of something unknown about his life or his work or his relationships. He had been killed because a drunk man next door did not treat his weapon with the care it demanded. That knowledge was terrible, but it was comprehensible. And comprehensibility is what grief needs to begin moving. When Susie stood in that courtroom and spoke, she was not speaking only to Lance Mueller. She was speaking to everyone in that room and, through the coverage of the case, to everyone who would eventually hear about it. She was making a public statement about what had been done to her husband and what had been done to her by the silence that followed. And in doing so, she was doing something for all of the other families who are waiting for their own answers, who are living in their own versions of that terrible suspension between loss and understanding. She was saying that the fight is worth it, that the truth can be found, even when it seems buried, that a private investigator with a fresh perspective can find a toothpaste-covered bullet hole that a full police investigation had missed, that the fight is worth it. The landscape of true crime in America is full of families like Susie Flanagan's, families waiting for a resolution that has not yet come, pushing for answers that the official investigation has not yet produced, refusing to accept an incomplete accounting of what happened to the person they lost. Some of those families will get their answers. Some will not. The difference between the ones that do and the ones that don't is often a combination of factors: the specific nature of the crime, the evidence available, the quality of the investigation, the resources of the family, and sometimes simply fortune. But Susie Flanagan's case demonstrates that the families themselves are not passive actors in this process. The choice she made, to hire Ken Brennan, to keep pushing, to not accept the silence, was a choice that had consequences. It was a choice that ultimately changed the outcome. She was not just a recipient of the investigation's conclusions. She was a driver of those conclusions. And that is worth remembering. There are women all over this country right now who are in some version of what Susie was in during those months after Greg's death. Maybe their loved one was killed in a way that is officially unsolved. Maybe the investigation is formally active but effectively stalled. Maybe the official conclusion is one they believe is wrong, that does not match what they know about the person who died and the circumstances surrounding the death. These women are not unusual. They are the rule, not the exception, in the landscape of violent crime investigations that do not produce immediate clarity. And what Susie Flanagan's story offers them, what it offers all of us who carry the weight of unanswered questions, is the example of what determination looks like in practice. Not as an abstract virtue, but as a series of specific choices, made day after day, to keep going when stopping would be easier. That is the legacy of this case, beyond the legal proceedings and the forensic reconstruction and the 10-year prison sentence. The legacy is Susie's example. The legacy is the knowledge that a woman who loved her husband enough to fight for him, who loved the truth enough to pursue it even when the pursuit was expensive and exhausting and uncertain, that woman changed the outcome. She made a difference, and the people who stood between her and the truth eventually ran out of road. Now, as we move into the final sections of this story, I want to bring you back to the hotel room one more time. Not to room 349, not to the bullet hole and the toothpaste and the trajectory analysis. I want to bring you back to room 348. I want you to think about Greg Flanagan in that room in the way that he would have inhabited it on any other night. Not the last night, but any night. The way he set his suitcase down. The way he adjusted the thermostat. The way he found the remote and settled onto the bed and opened a root beer. The way the room felt the way it always felt to him, like a temporary home, like the comfortable, familiar interim between the work week and the real weekend, between Beaumont and Louisiana, between the week and Susie. He was comfortable there. He was at ease. He had his routine and his comforts and the quiet that he valued. And on that last Wednesday evening, he had Iron Man 2 on the television and a candy bar within reach and a cigarette and a message to send to his wife. He was, by every measure, doing fine. He was living exactly the life he had built for himself, in exactly the way he had built it. And then something came through the wall, and none of it mattered anymore. All of the routine and the reliability and the steadiness that had defined Greg Flanagan for 55 years, it was over in seconds. Before he could react, before he could understand what had happened, before he could call for help or call Susie or do anything at all. That is the part that stays with you. Not the investigation, not the cover-up, not the sentence. The fact that it was over before Greg had any chance to respond to it. The fact that the last fully conscious experience he had, the last thing he was aware of before the catastrophic interruption, was a movie and a root beer and a message sent to his wife. That was his last evening. That was the entirety of September 15th, 2010, for Greg Flanagan, and then it was over. There is a quality that some investigators develop over long careers, a quality that you might call empathetic imagination, that allows them to inhabit the perspective of the victims they are working for in a way that goes beyond the professional. It is not detachment. It is not the clinical distance that some people assume investigators must maintain to do their jobs effectively. It is something more nuanced than that. It is the ability to understand, fully and humanly, what was at stake for the person at the center of the case, to hold their life and their death as real and significant rather than merely procedural, while still maintaining the clarity of thinking that effective investigation requires. Ken Brennan appears to have that quality. The way he has spoken about Greg Flanagan, in the interviews and accounts that have emerged from the case over the years, suggests that he carried Greg's personhood with him through the investigation in a way that informed his work. He was not just looking for a bullet. He was looking for what happened to a man, a specific man, a man with a wife and a routine and a preference for a cold room, and a last message that said, "You're doing good, babe." That specificity, that particularity, that insistence on the human rather than the merely procedural, is what distinguishes the best investigators from the adequate ones. The adequate investigator works the evidence. The best investigator works the evidence and the person the evidence belongs to. And they are never the same investigation. This quality, this insistence on the human, is also what distinguishes the best true crime from the merely sensational. The best true crime never forgets that the case it is presenting was also a life. That behind the autopsy photographs and the police reports and the court transcripts there is a person who woke up on the last morning of their life and had no idea it was the last morning. Greg Flanagan woke up on September 15th, 2010, and he drove to work, and he did his job, and he came back to the hotel, and he settled in for the evening, and he was Greg Flanagan, fully and completely, right up until the moment he stopped being anything. There was no gradual fade. There was no preparation or farewell or completion of the things that needed completing. There was just a man in a hotel room, and then there was a man on a carpet, and between those two things was a bullet and a wall, and a catastrophic failure of care by the person holding the gun. The families of people who die suddenly, in accidents, in random violence, in the kind of instant, unforeseeable death that Greg Flanagan died, often describe a particular feature of their grief that distinguishes it from the grief of people who lose loved ones to illness or gradual decline. The feature is the absence of completion. When someone dies of a long illness, there is usually time. Time to say the things that need to be said, to have the conversations that have been deferred, to arrive at some version of resolution before the end. When someone dies suddenly, that time does not exist. The relationship ends in mid-sentence. The deferred conversation never happens. The trip that was going to happen next month never happens. And the survivors are left holding all of that incompleteness, all of the things that were going to happen and did not happen, as a permanent feature of their grief. Susie Flanagan lost Greg in mid-sentence. Not literally, but in the sense that his death interrupted a life that was ongoing, a relationship that was active and present and moving forward, with plans and habits and ordinary future events that would never happen now. She was not holding a completed story. She was holding a story with no ending. And then, for months, she was holding a story with no ending and no explanation of why it had stopped where it did. The investigation gave her the ending, eventually. It gave her the explanation. But it could not give her the completion that Greg's sudden death had taken. That was gone. That was the permanent cost. And she has been living with that cost ever since. The way all survivors of sudden violent death live with the cost. Not always at the front of consciousness, but always there, in the background, in the places where Greg used to be. What the investigation did give her was justice. Not perfect justice. No justice is ever perfect, but real justice. The truth established beyond legal doubt. The person responsible, convicted and sentenced. The lie exposed. The silence broken. Those things matter. They are not compensation for what was lost, but they are something. They are the acknowledgement that the world has that what happened to Greg Flanagan was wrong, that it had consequences, that it was taken seriously, that it was pursued, that the people responsible were held accountable. In a universe where the randomness of violent death can feel deeply indifferent, where a bullet passes through a wall and ends a life with no regard for the quality of that life, for the plans that life had, for the people who depended on it, the existence of justice is the human assertion that the randomness was not the last word. That something deliberate and purposeful and aimed at truth followed the randomness and named it and held it to account. That is what the law is at its best. Not a machine for producing satisfaction or revenge or catharsis. A machine for producing acknowledgement. For saying, this happened. This was wrong. This had consequences. We, as a society, took it seriously. And then there is the question of what comes after. After the sentencing, after the courtroom, after the case is officially resolved. What comes after for the people who have been living inside it? For Susie, what came after was the long and ongoing work of constructing a life that does not include Greg, but does include all of the things she learned about herself during the fight for justice. She learned that she could push when pushing seemed impossible. She learned that the right person with the right approach could find the answer that nobody else had found. She learned that the love she had for Greg was not exhausted by his death, or by the investigation, or by the courtroom. That it was something she could carry forward into a life that he was no longer physically part of. She learned that she was stronger than the worst thing that had happened to her, which is perhaps the most important thing that any survivor can learn. These are not easy lessons. They do not make the grief smaller or the loss less real. They do not fill the space that Greg occupied, but they are the lessons that allow a person to keep going, to keep investing in a life that matters, to resist the pull toward the permanent suspension of a grief that has not yet found its resolution. Susie found her resolution. Not a perfect one, not a complete one, but a real one. And she went on. The electricians who were not Lance Mueller, the other men in room 349 on September 15, 2010, represent a more complex aspect of the story's aftermath. They were witnesses to what happened. They were complicit in the cover-up. The specific legal consequences each of them faced depended on their level of involvement and the evidence available regarding their specific actions that night. Steinmetz cooperated with the investigation, provided the testimony that cracked the case open, and presumably received some form of consideration for that cooperation. The exact legal outcomes for each individual in the group are part of the official record of the proceedings. But the moral weight of what they had done, and of the choice they eventually made, or were pushed into making, to tell the truth, is something that belongs to their own reckoning. What is important to say here, for the purposes of this story, is that the cover-up required all of them. It was not Mueller alone who sealed the truth in that wall with toothpaste. It was a group decision, a group silence, sustained collectively over months. Each of them made the choice, every day. And the eventual cracking of that silence, through Brennan's investigation, through Steinmetz's testimony, through the recorded call, was also the result of the cover-up reaching its limits. Cover-ups have limits. They have the limits of the people sustaining them, and the limits of the evidence that eventually builds up around them, and the limits of the investigators who are patient and skilled enough to identify the weak points and press. This cover-up lasted more than a year. That is not a trivially long time. But it did not last forever. It could not. Because the truth was too well documented in the physical world, the bullet hole, the trajectory, the body of Greg Flanagan, to remain permanently hidden. And perhaps that is another thing this story teaches us. Not as comfort, exactly, but as orientation. Cover-ups are not permanent. Lies have a limited lifespan. The people who choose silence over truth do not do so without consequence, and they do not always get to choose forever. Sometimes the investigator with fresh eyes comes along. Sometimes the witness who was carrying the most weight breaks. Sometimes the toothpaste in the wall is not quite perfect enough to fool the person who is specifically looking for it. The truth does not always come out, but it often does. And the people who are waiting for it, the Susie Flanagans of the world, should not give up on it, because giving up is the one thing that absolutely guarantees it will never arrive. Stay with me. We are heading into the final portion of tonight's story, and what is coming is worth staying awake for. Let us talk about what we have been calling the investigation from a different angle now. Let us talk about it from the angle of what it took from everyone involved. Because investigations like this one, the ones that go deep, that require sustained commitment over months or years, that penetrate the kind of deliberate concealment that the men in room 349 maintained, take something from the people who pursue them. Not just time and resources, though they take those too. They take emotional energy. They take the kind of focused attention that cannot be sustained without cost. And they take something from the personal life of every person who gives that much of themselves to a professional mission. Detective Scott Apple worked the Flanagan case for months before Brennan came in, and he continued to work it alongside Brennan through to its conclusion. In interviews that have touched on the case, Apple has described the particular frustration of a case that presents no apparent path forward. The difficulty of working a murder investigation where every lead terminates in nothing. There is a particular kind of professional discomfort that comes with that situation, because good detectives are defined by their ability to solve cases, and a case that cannot be solved challenges that self-definition in a way that is both professional and personal. Apple kept working because that is what he did, because giving up was not in his professional or personal vocabulary. But the case cost him something. It required him to sit with an unsolved murder in a way that few cases do, to stay with the uncertainty longer than he was comfortable with, to trust that the answer was out there and that persistence would eventually find it. Brennan's engagement with the case was different in its texture, shorter in duration, more intensely focused, aimed at a specific conclusion from the beginning. But the kind of investigation Brennan conducted is not the kind you do without getting personally invested, and personal investment has its own costs. The moment he stood in room 348 and felt the picture of what had happened crystallizing in his mind, the moment the cigarette clue clicked into place and he saw the outline of Greg's last moments, that was the moment Greg Flanagan stopped being a name in a case file and became a person that Brennan was going to solve for. And solving for a person is different from solving a puzzle. It carries weight. It carries the obligation to get it right, not just professionally, but morally. To honor the life at the center of the case by treating the investigation with the care and the seriousness it deserved. That weight is part of what makes investigators like Brennan different from the average. Most people, placed in front of the same case file, would have seen the same information that the official investigation had seen and reached the same conclusions. The absence of evidence of assault. The preliminary natural causes hypothesis. The investigation that found nothing because it was looking for something that had not happened. Most people would have accepted those conclusions, not because they were incurious or unintelligent, but because the conclusions were reasonable given the initial information. The additional step, The step of asking whether the initial information was complete, whether the absence of obvious evidence was really the absence of evidence at all, whether there was a different framework through which the existing evidence pointed toward a different conclusion. That step requires something beyond ordinary analytical skill. It requires the willingness to disagree with the official record, to assert that the smart and experienced people who had already looked at this case had missed something, to stake your own credibility on that assertion and then go looking for what you said was there. Brennan did that. He staked his credibility on the assertion that Greg had been killed by a projectile fired from the adjacent room, before he had the bullet hole to show anyone. He said, "I think I know how he died," before he had confirmed any of it. That is a professional risk. If he had been wrong, if the investigation of the walls had found nothing, if the trajectory analysis had not supported the theory, if the autopsy had definitively ruled out a projectile, he would have been wrong very publicly and in a context that mattered enormously to the family who had hired him. That risk was real. He accepted it because the evidence, as he read it, pointed unambiguously in the direction he was pointing. But the willingness to accept that risk is not a given. Many people, even skilled investigators, retreat from bold theories when the stakes are high enough. Brennan did not retreat. He followed the evidence where it led and said out loud what it was telling him, and he was right. Being right, solving the case, did not make the weight of it disappear. Brennan has described the Flanagan case as one that has stayed with him, that returns in the way that certain cases do, that represents something more than a professional accomplishment. It represents the successful honoring of an obligation, the obligation that Susie Flanagan placed on him when she hired him, and the deeper obligation that Greg Flanagan's life placed on anyone who heard his story and tried to understand what had happened to him. Those obligations have a weight that does not lift entirely when the case is resolved. The case is resolved, but Greg is still dead. The truth is known, but the loss is still real. The investigation was successful, but the reason the investigation was necessary, the carelessness and the cover-up and the months of Susie's unanswered grief, those things happened. And knowing that they happened, having been the person who uncovered them, carries something. It does not debilitate, but it stays. Now let us think about the broader landscape in which this case exists. Because the Greg Flanagan case is not entirely without precedent. There is a category of violent death that is sometimes called stray bullet or unintentional discharge death. Deaths caused by firearms being discharged accidentally or carelessly, with the projectile traveling in an unintended direction and striking an unintended target. These cases occur across the country with a frequency that is not widely appreciated. In apartment buildings, in houses with thin walls, in vehicles, in public spaces, bullets that miss their intended target or have no intended target at all and find their way to someone who had no connection to the circumstances of the discharge. These deaths are tragedies in the purest sense because they combine genuine innocent victimhood with genuine preventability. They were not inevitable. They were the product of choices: to carry a weapon in a particular setting, to handle it carelessly, to fail to treat it with the constant attention that a lethal tool demands. Greg Flanagan's death belongs to that category. It was not a targeted killing. It was not the outcome of any conflict or relationship or decision involving Greg. It was a stray bullet death, death as the consequence of carelessness by a stranger in an adjacent room. What distinguished it from many others in that category was the combination of factors that made it initially appear as something else entirely. The wall between the rooms, which concealed the mechanism of death. The absence of an obvious entry wound, which obscured the cause of death. The initial conclusion of natural causes, which directed the investigation away from the truth. These factors together created the mystery that took more than a year to resolve. Without them, Greg's death would have been immediately recognizable for what it was, and the investigation would have proceeded along entirely different lines. With them, it became the extraordinary case that Ken Brennan eventually solved. The lesson from the broader landscape of stray bullet deaths is uncomfortable and important. It is that the walls between us and the people in adjacent spaces, in hotels, in apartments, in houses, in any structure where human beings live and work in proximity, are not the guarantees of separation that they feel like. They are physical barriers, which is not the same thing as absolute protection. The person on the other side of the wall is an unknown. Their choices, their state of impairment, their care or carelessness with whatever tools they have access to, are beyond your control and beyond your knowledge. You are, in a literal physical sense, connected to them by proximity, separated by a layer of drywall that a bullet can pass through without appreciable resistance. This is not a comfortable thought, and it is not meant to be. It is the reality that Greg Flanagan's death makes visible. And making it visible, taking it seriously, allowing it to inform the way we think about responsibility and carelessness and the obligations we owe to the people who happen to share our spaces. That is the work that a story like this one asks of its audience. Not just to hear the story and feel the sadness of it and then move on, but to carry something from it. To let it change something, however small, about the way we think about the choices we make that have the potential to reach through walls and affect people we cannot see. If you are still watching, you are the kind of person who takes these stories seriously. You are the kind of person who carries them. And I am grateful for that. In the final sections ahead, we are going to bring together all the threads of this story into a close that honors Greg Flanagan and Susie Flanagan and the long, difficult, ultimately successful fight for the truth that his death demanded. We are almost there. The MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, still exists. People still check in, still take the elevator to their floors, still slide their key cards into the slots of their room doors and settle in for the night. Room 348 is still a room. People have slept in it since Greg Flanagan died there. People have watched television in it and ordered room service and made phone calls and lived their brief, ordinary hotel stay lives in it without knowing what happened there on the night of September 15th, 2010. That is not strange. Exactly. Every space has a history, and hotel rooms in particular have hosted more human events than most people care to think about. But there is something that makes you pause, knowing what you now know about that corridor, about the wall between 348 and 349, about the night that changed everything for the people connected to it. The hotel is a material fact in the landscape of a city that mostly does not think about this case. Beaumont goes about its life. The oil and gas industry in southeast Texas goes about its work. The electricians who were in room 349 that night have gone on with their lives, in whatever form those lives have taken since 2010. Lance Mueller served his sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The case was closed, in the formal sense that cases are closed when a conviction is obtained and a sentence is served. And yet it is not entirely closed, in the way that cases involving human loss are never entirely closed. Greg Flanagan is still dead. Susie Flanagan is still without him. Those are the permanent facts of the case that no legal proceeding can alter. What the case gave Susie, ultimately, was the ability to build her grief on a foundation of truth rather than uncertainty. That is not a small thing. Grief built on uncertainty is unstable. It cannot fully settle, cannot fully process, because the ground beneath it keeps shifting. There is always another question. There is always another angle that has not been resolved. There is always the possibility that the explanation you have arrived at is incomplete or wrong. Grief built on truth is still grief. It is not lighter, not easier, not less permanent, but it has a quality of stability that allows the process of integration to proceed. Susie knew what had happened to Greg. She knew why he was in the position he was found in, with the cigarette in his left hand. She knew about the circuit breaker and the movie and the moment he stood up and walked toward the door. She knew about the bullet and the wall and the toothpaste. And she knew about the choice that the men next door had made to stay silent. She knew all of it. And with that knowledge as her foundation, she could begin the work of building a life that acknowledged Greg's absence without being defined by the questions that his absence had initially raised. There is a particular type of strength that comes from this kind of fight. Not the strength of someone who was never hurt. That is invulnerability, which is different and arguably less admirable than real strength. Real strength is the kind that Susie Flanagan demonstrated. The strength of a person who was hurt, deeply and irreversibly, and who chose not to let that hurt be the final word. Who looked at the silence surrounding her husband's death and decided to break it. Who put resources and time and emotional energy into a search for the truth when it would have been so much more understandable to retreat into grief and let the investigation run its course, whatever that course turned out to be. She did not retreat. She engaged. She pushed. And the pushing made a difference. In a country full of unsolved cases, full of families waiting for the answers they are owed, full of investigations that have gone cold and may never be reopened. Susie Flanagan's example is not just a personal story. It is a model. It is an example of what active, determined pursuit of justice looks like in practice. It is the demonstration that families are not passive recipients of whatever the official investigation produces. They are participants. They have agency. They can make choices that change the outcome, if they have the knowledge and the resources and the courage to make those choices. Not every family will have the resources that Susie had. The ability to hire a Ken Brennan is not something that every grieving family in America can afford. That is a painful and important inequality in the landscape of justice. But the principle that Susie's choices demonstrate, that the family's engagement matters, that the refusal to accept an incomplete explanation is legitimate and potentially consequential. That principle is available to anyone. And now, as we come to the final passage of this long night, let us talk one more time about the specifics of what was found in that hotel room. Not as forensics, not as evidence, as the material remnants of a life. The suitcase on the floor. Greg never used the luggage rack. He put his suitcase on the floor the way he always did, the way that felt natural to him, the way he had done it every week for however many weeks of hotel stays his work had required. It was a habit, a tiny, unremarkable habit that says something precise about who he was. Someone who was so familiar with this particular space, this particular room, that he did not need the hotel's furniture in the way a first-time guest might need it. He had made the room his own, in the minimal but genuine way that you make temporary spaces your own when you live in them regularly enough. His space, his habits, his suitcase on the floor. The thermostat cranked down cold. He liked it cold. That was his preference, consistent and established. It said something about his comfort level with the room, about his ownership of the space. He did not leave the thermostat where it was. He adjusted it to where he wanted it. He made the temperature conform to his preference. That too is a tiny thing. That too says something. The candy bar, the root beer, the cigarettes. These were not luxury items. They were not extravagances. They were the simple, specific pleasures that Greg Flanagan had identified over the years as the things that made a hotel room feel comfortable enough to live in for a few days a week. They were his version of making himself at home. The root beer because he liked root beer. The candy bar because something sweet, late in the evening, was part of the routine. The cigarettes because they were part of how he relaxed and how he occupied the quiet of an evening alone. Simple, specific, entirely his. The television playing Iron Man 2. The choice of a movie that was entertaining without being demanding, that would carry him through the evening without requiring too much of him. That was good company in the way that a familiar film playing in a hotel room is good company. Not high art, just a good film. Just what Greg wanted on a Wednesday evening. And then the phone and the message to Susie. "You're doing good, babe." Said without thinking about its weight. Said because it was true and because he meant it, and because she was the person he sent small messages to in the evenings when they were apart. Said as part of the fabric. As one tile in the mosaic. The tile that turned out to be the last one. These details are everything. They are the evidence that Greg Flanagan lived fully and specifically. Not as a victim, not as a case study, not as the protagonist of a true crime narrative, but as a human being with preferences and habits and loves and ordinary evenings. He was not, before he became part of this story, a person with any public identity. He was a private man, a working man, a husband. He did not seek attention or notice. He lived his life quietly and well, and then he died in a way that was not quiet and not well at all, and the subsequent investigation turned him, against all of his habits and preferences, into a public figure, into a case, into the body in room 348. But he was not just the body. He was the suitcase on the floor, and the cold air conditioner, and the root beer, and the last message. He was 55 years of an ordinary and valuable life, accumulated in the way that all good lives are accumulated, slowly, specifically, without fanfare. He was the kind of man who showed up to work on time and drove home on weekends and loved his wife in the quiet, consistent, absolutely reliable way that is the most real kind of love. He was Greg Flanagan, and he deserved better than a bullet through a wall. He deserved his next week, and the week after that, and all the weeks that were supposed to come after. He deserved more tiles in the mosaic. He deserved more evenings with the air conditioner running cold, and the television on and the message sent and answered. He deserved the rest of his life. He did not get it. And the reason he did not get it was a man with a gun and a bottle of something, and the terrible carelessness that comes from not treating a lethal thing like a lethal thing. And then the reason the truth about it was hidden for so long was the choice, the deliberate, terrible, daily choice, of the men who knew what had happened and said nothing while Susie Flanagan waited. Those choices have consequences. They always do. Sometimes the consequences arrive late, on the strength of a private investigator who notices which hand is holding a cigarette. Sometimes they require more than a year and a retired DEA agent and a wall search and a confession and a recorded phone call. But they arrive. Not always. Not as often as justice demands. But often enough that the people waiting for them, the Susie Flanagans, the families in the liminal space between loss and understanding, should not stop waiting. Should not stop pushing. Should not take the silence for the final answer. The truth was in the wall. It was always in the wall. It just needed someone patient enough to find it. We have come a long way tonight. We started in a hotel corridor, with a manager turning a key and a door swinging open and a man on the floor. We have been through every chapter of the story, through Greg's life and routine and the warmth of who he was, through the impossible autopsy that turned a natural death into a murder with no crime scene, through the months of investigation that produced nothing, through Susie's refusal to accept the silence, through Ken Brennan's methodical and brilliant work, through the cigarette and the temperature and the circuit breaker and the wall and the toothpaste. We have been through the confession and the recorded phone call and the courtroom. We have been through the sentencing and Susie's words and the aftermath. And now we are here, at the end, which is also not quite the end, because the stories of the people involved continue past the point where we stop telling them. But before we close this chapter, I want to spend a few more minutes with you in something that true crime often rushes past. I want to spend a few more minutes with what it means to be the kind of person who tells the truth. Because this story, at its deepest level, is about truth. It is about the truth that was inside the wall, literally and metaphorically. It is about the people who tried to bury that truth and the people who refused to let it stay buried. And it is about what the truth ultimately costs and what it ultimately gives. The men who covered up Greg Flanagan's death chose a particular kind of safety. The safety of silence. The safety of the unasked question. The safety of a world in which the bullet hole was filled and nobody came looking. They chose it for understandable reasons. They were frightened. They were calculating consequences. They were doing the thing that frightened people do, which is to protect themselves in the short term at the cost of something larger and more significant in the long term. And the long term always comes. It came for Tim Steinmetz, who eventually cracked under the weight of what he was carrying. It came for Lance Mueller, who heard his own story reflected back at him in a phone call he did not know was being recorded. The long term always comes, and when it comes, the calculation that seemed rational in the short term reveals itself to have been a terrible bargain. The people who chose the truth, Susie, Brennan, Apple, chose it at cost too. The truth was not easy for any of them. It required from Susie the sustained courage to keep pressing when the path forward was unclear. It required from Brennan the professional risk of a bold theory and the personal investment of doing this not just as a job, but as an act of genuine care for a family he had come to represent. It required from Apple the ego flexibility to bring in an outsider and work alongside someone whose perspective challenged the assumptions of the official investigation. These were not costless choices. They were difficult ones, but they were the right ones. And the truth that they produced was worth every bit of the cost. There is a line from Susie Flanagan's victim impact statement that I want to return to one more time before we close. You didn't intentionally seek him out, but you murdered him with every lie you told. That line has been with us through the entire second half of this story, and I want to be precise about why it is so powerful. It is not powerful because it is harsh. It is powerful because it is accurate. It is precise. It draws a distinction that most people's language would blur, the distinction between the act itself and the concealment of the act, between the accident and the choice that followed it. It names the choice. It says, you chose. You were not compelled. You were frightened, yes, but fear does not compel. It influences. It colors. But you still chose. And the choosing has a victim. The victim is not abstract. The victim has a name, and her name is Susie, and she stood in front of you and said, I know what you chose. I know what it cost me. I know. In the years since the sentencing, There has been discussion about this case in contexts beyond the true crime community. In discussions of tort liability and hotel security, as mentioned, in discussions of firearms law and the standards for criminally negligent discharge, in discussions of what is sometimes called the Good Samaritan question, the question of whether a person who has caused harm, even accidentally, has a legal and moral obligation to render aid or at minimum to report what has happened. These discussions are important. They are the conversations that could lead to changes in law, in practice, in culture, that might reduce the likelihood of another Greg Flanagan dying in another hotel room because a careless person next door did not treat their weapon with the respect it demanded. But all of those broader conversations are downstream of the specific human story of one man and one woman and one hotel room in Beaumont, Texas. They have their place. This moment at the end of a long night, belongs to Greg and Susie, to the candy bar and the root beer, to the air conditioner running cold, to the movie on the television, to the last message. You're doing good, babe. He meant it. He meant every word. He sent it without knowing it would be the last thing he ever sent, which is the only way anyone should ever send a message like that, without knowing, without weight, without the shadow of finality. Just as a small, genuine, daily expression of love. Just as one tile in the mosaic. Just as Greg. Just as the man he always was, steady and quiet and showing up and loving his wife in the way he knew how to love her, which was simply and consistently and without performance. She was doing good, and he told her so. And she got to carry that with her out of the worst year of her life and into whatever came after. That is something. In a story full of terrible things, the carelessness, the cover-up, the months of silence, the grief that had no explanation, that is the thing that holds its shape. The love that was real, the man who was good, the life that was well lived right up until it was taken. Those things are permanent in a different way than the crime is permanent. The crime happened, and it cannot be undone. But the life was real, and it cannot be unmade either. Greg Flanagan was here. He loved his wife. He drove to Beaumont every Monday and did his job and drove home every Sunday and was present for all of it. That is real. That happened. And it matters, independent of and beyond the circumstances of his death. The story of Greg Flanagan is, in the end, a story about what survives. The love survives. The memory survives. The example of Susie's determination survives. The work of Brennan and Apple survives as a case study in how the impossible becomes possible when the right questions are asked. And the truth survives, as it almost always does, eventually. Not fast enough, not easily enough, not without cost. But it survives. It was in the wall, and it was found. And the world is a slightly more just place because it was found. If you have been with this story from the very beginning, if you followed Greg from his Louisiana home to his hotel room, and through the months of investigation, and into the courtroom, and out the other side, then you know how much of yourself you have given to it tonight. You know what it takes to stay with something this long, to let it matter, to not look away from the difficult parts. That is not nothing. That is the thing that makes this community worth being part of. So now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you from tonight's story. Was it the cigarette clue? Was it Susie's words in the courtroom? Was it the image of Greg sending that last message without knowing it was the last one? Was it something else entirely? Tell me what you are going to carry from this. What small change it has made in how you think about the ordinary, about the people you love, about the walls between you and the strangers you share your spaces with. Tell me where you are watching from and what device you are on, and whether the person next to you, or the person you are going to call after this, knows that they are doing good. Tell them if they are. Do not wait for a special occasion. Greg Flanagan did not know that Wednesday evening was the last one. Send the message tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button. Not because of an algorithm, not for any reason except that stories like Greg Flanagan's deserve an audience that will carry them. An audience of people who take these stories seriously, who bring them back to the real world, who let them do the work they are meant to do. Be that audience. Subscribe. Like the video if Greg's story moved you, and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. This was the body in room 348. Greg Flanagan was here. He mattered. He still matters. And the truth was always in the wall. Thank you for watching. Good night.